Hey everyone, we are excited to have you join us here shortly. We're going to get started in about 1 minute, just doing a quick audio check here. Look forward to having everyone here with us. We will have a few folks in the chat to answer questions as they come up. But we're going to go ahead and after we do this quick audio check, I'm going to put a timer up here so you know when we will get started. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Well, welcome everyone to our Learn with the Nerds event titled Power BI Beginner to Pro. This is an exciting day. We have quite a bit of material that we're going to be going over today. We are going to be starting at a beginner level for some. So for those of you that are brand new to Power BI and joining us and learning about Power BI for the first time, hopefully you will get a lot of great information out of today. If you've been working with Power BI for some time, we'll also have some sections geared towards you to kind of lean you up into that pro part of the title there. So we'll have quite a bit of different elements of what we discuss with inside Power BI for today's class. My name is Devin Knight. I am the president of training at Pragmatic. So we do a lot of these free events, but we also do and have a set of paid training that we do as well that we'd love to share with you about, of course, at some point. But before we do that, let's of course jump into our plan for today. So for today, we obviously have quite a bit to cover in a 3-hour period to make you hopefully a pro with Power BI in that short amount of time. We have a lot that we're going to cover, and really we're going to really jump right into it. I'm not going to show you a ton of slides. I have maybe 2 slides to kind of get you going and have a brief understanding of how the tool works. But our goal is to really jump rather quickly into developing a solution with Power BI. And guess what? You get to do it with us. I have a couple folks from my team that are monitoring the chat. That's Matt and Julia, and they'll be able to assist with questions. They obviously, we're planning to have a very large group today, so they're going to be rapidly helping folks out with questions that you may have. And one thing that I always like to make sure I note when we do things like YouTube streams like this, you can rewind me. You don't have to ask, can I see that again? Use the YouTube player and you can push back, almost like you're pushing back a recording device that you have at home. You can push back my video and watch something that I did as many times as you want. So no need to ask, can you show that again? Because you can watch it yourself again and you can kind of catch back up as we do breaks. We will have a couple breaks, by the way, during this 3-hour period. So again, our goal for today, though, is we want to get you a pretty good understanding of Power BI. You are going to be able to follow along. I'm going to go at a pace that you can follow along. But again, if I do go too fast, feel free to rewind. And so what you'll need for today is you will need the Power BI desktop. The Power BI desktop is the main application that you'll use for developing Power BI solutions. That's what I'm going to be using on my screen. You will need that on yours as well to be able to follow along. Now, if you have not installed that, even to this point right now, you still have time to do it. And my folks, Matt and Julia, will obviously post those links in the chat, and you'll also, I think, see it in the description. But that will allow you to be able to follow along. You don't need to have any special files downloaded for today, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using a web source as our data source for today's example. So we're going to be connecting into a data.gov, where we can find a government data source that we can use. And for some of you, if you've seen some of our demonstrations before, you maybe actually have seen this example before. It might not be new to you. but we're going to kind of get an idea of how we can connect and work together on building this solution and really get hopefully a good end-to-end picture of how Power BI works in today's session. And along the way, I want to try and drop in nice little nuggets of, I'd say, more advanced material for those of you that are already been in that beginner realm and you're ready to move on to more of that pro side of things. I'm going to make sure I highlight a few more advanced features as we go throughout the day. So briefly, I do have a few slides here. I'm going to bring those up here now to kind of get us started. So let me share my screen properly here. There we go. All right, so real quickly, what I'd like to do is kind of put in the context of, obviously we're focused on Power BI here today, but Power BI is one part of a platform of tools known as the Microsoft Power Platform. So if you're not familiar with the Power Platform, it might be because you've been very focused on one of these tools individually, whether that be Power Apps or Power Automate, or for many of you, that'd be Power BI. But what I have found is it's really helpful to understand that Power BI is one of these 4 packages of tools, or one of these 4 tools that are part of the package known as the Power Platform. So Power BI, at the very least, you should know, is more of a reporting tool, right? It's a reporting and analytics tool that allows you to build visuals and dashboards and analytics on top of your data. So it's kind of a reactive, take the data I have and be able to build out visuals on top of it. But that's not the only tool that exists within inside the Power Platform. I'm going to take myself off screen here for a moment so you can see all of the slide here. But in addition to Power BI as that reporting tool, you also have tools known as Power Apps. And Power Apps is the rapid application development tool that allows you as a business user to develop your own applications. You also have Power Automate, which is kind of a workflow automation tool. That workflow automation tool allows you to create automations, or they call them flows. And those flows allow you to create these basically triggered events that kick off a process based on your trigger initiating. And then the 4th tool that you'll see here is Power Virtual Agents. And Power Virtual Agents is a chatbot tool. And that chatbot tool allows you as a business user to be able to build out your own chatbot so that way you can have your end users engage with a AI chatbot that you have designed. Now, the major theme that you'll see across all 4 of these tools is that they are designed for business users. And business users are the main audience of who would actually develop and use and leverage the Power Platform tools, whether we're talking about Power BI, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents, or Power Apps. They are all tools that are designed for business users to be able to solve their own problems. And that's where you kind of hear this term of citizen developer come out to play, where you as an end user or as a business user can actually use these tools to solve your own problem. And so that's really the power of the Power Platform. Now, built on top of the Power Platform, it's built on top of the architecture of Azure, that's Microsoft's cloud, which also has things like various data connectors that are available across all of the platform, whether it be Power BI or Power Apps. There's many, many different data connectors you have available. So if you're trying to connect into a particular data source, you likely have a data connector already available for those. You have things like AI Builder for building out artificial intelligence capability, but again, you don't have to be a developer to leverage these AI features. AI Builder actually allows the data consumer, or I should say the business user, to be able to leverage and use AI capabilities on your own. You don't have to have a developer to leverage those AI features. And then finally, the last mentioned in the bottom right, this is why I took myself off camera, is Dataverse. And Dataverse is this database that goes across the entire Power Platform. You're going to predominantly see it used in Power Apps and Power Automate, but it's also available, and you'll see it on my screen as we get into the Power BI desktop, it's also available inside of Power BI as a data connector. So you can connect into a Dataverse database that you've created and build solutions and reports on top of your Dataverse database. So kind of think of the Dataverse database here, or the Dataverse solution, as the data store that crosses the entire Power Platform. Whether you're using any 4 of these tools, you can have data that's stored within inside Dataverse. And Dataverse is really designed to very easily interconnect into every element within inside of the Power Platform. Now, we're not going to focus a lot on the majority of what we see on the screen here. Our real focus for today is, of course, Power BI. So we're going to be focused and discussing Power BI throughout today. And so because of that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the process of creating a Power BI project. So the phases of a Power BI project are really threefold here, or I should say fourfold for that matter. And those different steps that you have with inside of any Power BI project are going to start with this data discovery phase. And the data discovery phase is all about connecting into the various data sources that you have, which oftentimes may be more than one. You might have more than one data source you need to be able to answer any one question within inside of your ecosystem. But also as part of that data discovery phase, you also have the opportunity to do data cleansing. So the idea of data cleansing is not only am I going to connect to my data, but I likely have some issues with that data that I need to appropriately clean up and fix before I go to present that data in any kind of report. So that data cleansing capability that exists inside Power BI is known as Power Query. And that Power Query tool that's part of Power BI is a really powerful component to allow you to, again, create a set of business rules to fix data as it comes in. And there's a lot that goes into that. We could have an entire class just focused on Power Query, and we could spend 3 hours just talking about Power Query, or even a whole week just talking about Power Query. But that's that first phase of any Power BI project, is that data discovery phase to go connect into my data and then appropriately clean any kind of poorly formed data as it comes in. The second phase of any Power BI project is more of this data modeling or data mashup phase. And this phase is all about creating relationships between the various data sources you have. Because likely, there's many cases when you have a question about your data, you might need to connect into more than one data source to be able to truly get the answer to that question. Think about it. If you wanted to know what is profit for my organization, if you're trying to determine profit, you likely need to connect into 4 or 5 different data sources to really get all of your expenses, all of your revenue, payroll information, inventory, all the stuff that you need to wrap in together to determine what profit is for your organization. You're likely touching multiple data sources to really get that answer. In some cases, that might lean into more of an enterprise solution like a data warehouse. But the data modeling with inside Power BI does allow you as a business user to connect into those various data sources that you have and then create relationships between them. So if I need to go pull in some payroll information from, let's say, Oracle, and I have some sales data in SQL Server, and I have some mainframe data and Excel spreadsheets and Access databases and all of these different data sources, you can interconnect them together using the data modeling and data mashup capabilities within inside Power BI. The other part that goes into your data model that you create is where you'll also define and create calculations using a formula language known as DAX. DAX is the Data Analysis Expression Language. We're going to very briefly touch on that today, obviously in a 3-hour time frame. We're not going to be able to get super deep into that, but I would encourage you to check out some of our additional training. We have 2 separate full classes just on DAX through our on-demand learning portal. But there's a lot that you can learn when it comes into the data modeling components. DAX is a big part of that, and we're going to get you a little bit of a peek at what that looks like today. Now, the part that most people think of when they think of Power BI is data visualizations, right? You generally think of whenever you're creating a BI solution, you think of data visualizations, building out visuals, creating reports and dashboards. But as you can see, that's really kind of the second half of any kind of BI project that you create. And I say BI generically because that's true whether it be an enterprise BI solution that IT is doing or whether it be more of a self-service BI solution that you do through Power BI. You really have to focus in on those first 2 phases that are mentioned here, that being data discovery and data modeling, to be able to properly create reports. And that's the next phase here, though, is the data visualization side of things. And through the data visualization aspect, you're building out visuals, reports, you're filtering your data. You can create things like storytelling through Power BI. You can build out things like personalized bookmarks. There's all sorts of things that go into the data visualization side of things. But the main point here is that while data visualizations is the big aspect of Power BI that everyone, as far as end users, sees as an end result, it really is kind of the downward part. I say it almost sounds negative, but it's not negative. It's the last part of the BI project that you do. You have to first make sure your data model and your data discovery and data cleansing pieces are done properly before you can have a well done set of reports. So that's a key part here to realize that it's a very powerful part of Power BI, but it's not the only part that goes into any kind of BI solution. Now, once you've done these first 3 steps, these are primarily going to be done through the Power BI desktop. Now, some of these can be done from your web browser through the Power BI service, but these are primarily going to be done through the Power BI desktop application that we are going to start to talk about here in a few moments. These first 3 steps can be done for free within inside the Power BI desktop. So the Power BI desktop is free. There's no licensing cost to the Power BI desktop. You may be prompted to sign into a Power BI account, but you can kind of get past that, and you can do whatever you want within inside the Power BI desktop at no charge. Where licensing comes into play for Power BI, and we're not going to get super deep into licensing today, but where licensing does come into play with Power BI is when you go to share your solutions with others. So when you go to share your solutions with others, that's when you need to have a Power BI license, and also the people that are receiving your solution need to have a Power BI license as well. Now there's multiple levels of licensing that you can do. There is a Power BI Pro license, which is list price on Power BI's website is $10 per month per user. But there's also another licensing model known as Power BI Premium, which you can license either per user now. That's actually a new licensing model that used to only be kind of for bulk licensing, but they have a per user license for Power BI Premium, as well as the ability to license hundreds of users through premium capacity. Now, we're not going to get super deep into that. I would definitely recommend researching more and learning more about licensing with Power BI, but the key thing I want to let you know for now is that when you want to share with others, you need a license, they need a license. So that's one misconception that oftentimes happens with Power BI is people think you can share with others for free, but they're going to need a license as well, even when you do things like embed it in SharePoint, or if you embed it in Teams, which you can do. You can embed your solutions in SharePoint and Teams, and you do need a license in those scenarios as well. So this is really all I have for slides. I just wanted to kind of get you an idea at a high level of what are some of the things that you need to be thinking about as you go into a Power BI project. And what we're going to do next is we're going to jump right into it. I'm not going to delay kind of jumping into it because we have, of course, only 3 hours together. So I really want to jump you into immediately seeing what this tool is like in case you are new to it. And again, as we go along and as we work together, you're going to have the opportunity to pick up on some new, hopefully a small little advanced features for those of you that have been working with Power BI for some time. So I'm going to shift over to my screen once again. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and close out of our PowerPoint here for now. And I have open a web browser. And what we're going to do in this is, first thing I want to do is, Matt, I'm sure, has posted in the chat many times where you can go download the Power BI desktop. Hopefully by this point you have that Power BI desktop ready to go and installed on your machine. It's a pretty small install, so even if you're installing it right now, it'll only take a few moments. But what we're going to do is I want to set the scenario here for you for a few moments. Let me put myself back on camera here for a moment. So here's the scenario. Anytime you start a Power BI project, and let's say, for example, your company is interested in adopting Power BI, the best way to do that is to think through a good use case within your organization. And so I'm going to give you a use case, and we're going to follow this use case throughout today. And this is where, for those of you that have attended any of our classes before, you've likely seen this use case before. But the use case that we have that we're going to follow for today, and the reason why I like this one is because we can pull in data from the web and everybody can follow along. But we're going to be following along through a use case that we work for a bank. Okay, so let's say, imagine you work for a banking institute and that we are interested in launching and creating and building our next set of brick and mortar banking centers. Physical locations, right? You don't have a whole lot of new banks that open up around the world anymore. A lot of things are done through the internet now. Online banking obviously has higher prevalence now than ever. And so we have some budget in our company to be able to create a new and build a set of new physical brick and mortar banks in the United States. And so what I'd like to do is I want to pull in all sorts of data. We have all kind of data internally to help us make this decision. We have data that tells us where most of our customers are. We have data that tells us our most frequent customers. But what we'd like to do is see if there's any supplemental data that's outside of what we have within our organization that can also be at least an influencer into our decision on which one of the banks or which one of the locations around the country that we want to open up our next physical location. And so what we're going to do, and I would like you to follow along through portions of this, is we're going to have you open up your web browser on your screen. So you likely already have YouTube open. Open up another tab. And we're going to open and go to a URL, and I'm going to pull this up on my screen here as well. We're going to open and go to a website known as data.gov. Okay, so you're going to go to data.gov, and I'll leave that up here for just a few moments. And if we go to data.gov in your web browser, we'll be able to connect into a public data set that has a list of all of the failed banks within the United States over the last 20 years. So this is going to be an influencing or an influencer to our decision on maybe perhaps where we choose not to open a bank. Because if we see an area of the country that has a lot of failed banks, then maybe there's something going on, or maybe there's some kind of trend in that area that we might want to avoid. Again, not the overarching reason why we would choose to open a bank in one place or another, but it's going to be an influencer. All right, I'm stalling a little bit to give you time to go into your web browser and go to data.gov. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter now. And what's great about this website is they have tons of different data sets you can choose from. You can see there's 280 different data set, 280,000 different data sets you can choose from here. And what we want to do is in our scenario here is we're going to search for a data set called FDIC failed banks. Okay, so go ahead and search for that data set in the data.gov website. And again, I'm going to try and pause every few moments here to make sure you're able to keep up. But again, as a reminder, with inside YouTube, you can always rewind me and go back and see something if you missed it. I'm going to probably remind you that several times today. All right, so I'll hit enter on this. And that's going to return back 20 data sets that have something to do with FDIC failed banks. And the one that we want for our scenario is this very top one, this one called FDIC failed bank list. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and select that top listing right here. And that'll take us into the website where we can see the data connection or the file that we want to use. Okay. I should note here, by the way, and I'm sure Matt's put this in the chat, there's about a 30 to 40 second delay within my stream. So if Matt kind of runs in and said, hey, there's a question about this or something like that, there may be a little bit of a delay in me answering some things like that. There also should note that if we're about to have several hundred people that are going to this website, you could probably expect a little bit of a delay as we're all going to the exact same website at the exact same time. So plan for that, expect things like that to occur. Now, what I want to do is on this website is I would like to take this CSV file, this banklist.csv, and I would like to use it as a data source. Now, one of the really neat things about how Power BI works is you can actually connect into this data source from the web. And so rather than me having to download this data, so don't actually click the download link here, but if I were to click the download link, I could download this, save it somewhere locally, and then connect to the local CSV file I have. But what would be even better is if I could just point to the URL for where that file is stored and then use the URL as my data source. So that way, as the government updates that file, all I have to do is refresh my Power BI solution, and then the latest version of that data will come in. So it gives me the ability to kind of have almost like a closer to real-time view of my data. So it's skipping that step of having to download this and then storing it. I still will have to kind of work on some kind of data refresh process, which we'll talk a little bit later about in the last hour. But what I want to do is rather than downloading this file, instead I'm going to right-click on the download button here. So I'm going to right-click on download, and let me move my head here for a moment. I'm going to right-click on download, and we're going to select that I want to copy the link address. Now I'm using Google Chrome, and because I'm using Chrome, mine says copy link address. If you're using something like Edge, it might say copy shortcut. It might be some variation of this. But essentially, we want to copy the link for where the download button is going to take us. Now, Matt already has, who's in the chat, already has this URL, and he knows exactly the URL that I'm about to take. So I'm sure he will paste this in the chat if he hasn't already. I'm sure he will. He's on top of it. He'll get that posted in there for you. But I'm going to copy the link address here, and then I'm going to use this and take this over to Power BI. Okay. Now, Power BI is, the way we're going to start this is we're going to launch the Power BI desktop. So assuming you have already downloaded the Power BI desktop and installed it, which again, it's a pretty light install, so you could even, install it right now and catch up pretty quickly if you rewind my video a little bit. But I'll be able to launch and open the Power BI desktop right here. Now, I'm going to launch it from scratch because I do want you to see what this looks like when you open it for the first time. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the Power BI desktop. That'll take just a moment here. Looks like it's opening on my other screen. I'll make sure it comes over to the right place. There it goes. So when you open the Power BI desktop for the first time, and again, this is the main application that you're going to use to be able to develop Power BI solutions. When you open Power BI for the first time, you're generally presented this startup screen. However, if you may also be prompted to actually sign in. Now, you don't need to sign in for what we're doing for the first couple hours of the day. So if you're prompted to sign in or if you're prompted to sign up for a Power BI account, you can hit cancel past that. We will talk more about signing up for Power BI and what Power BI subscriptions mean a bit later. And so once you skip past the sign in or sign up process, you should see a start up screen that looks like this. And with inside the startup screen, this gives you a few things as far as where to get started with Power BI. On the left-hand side of the startup screen here, you'll see things like the recent files that you've opened. So there's some files that I've opened in the past on this machine, on this workstation. You'll also see things like the Get Data experience here. That will allow me to connect into whatever data source that we're using for our example. So I can click Get Data and kind of get started there. There are a few video tutorials here, but I don't know if you'll notice this, but they're pretty out of date. You can tell they're out of date because the view of the little screenshot here is kind of a darker view of the Power BI desktop, and it's quite different than what you actually see on my right-hand side. So they do need to go in there and update them. Of course, that's why we certainly recommend our training. We do keep it up to date. Then on the right-hand side of the startup screen, you'll see some useful links like the forums. So where do you go if you need help? If you need to ask a question, you can go to the forums. The Power BI blog is also a great place to go. The Power BI blog, by the way, I do recommend you keep a pretty close eye on because this is how I keep up to date with all the changes that happen with Power BI. You may or may not already realize this, but the Power BI desktop is updated on a very frequent basis. Generally, it's about once a month. There's some exceptions to that. But generally about once a month, you're going to have a new version of the Power BI desktop to install. So if you had the Power BI desktop already installed on your machine for today, you may notice that yours could be a little different than mine if you haven't installed the latest version in quite some time. They do update it very regularly. So the Power BI blog is a great place to go to keep up with all the changes. They do have a regular monthly entry, blog entry to tell you what's new with the tool. My colleague Matt Peterson and myself also do a video-based blog to let you know some of the new things that have come out with the tool as well. So there's a lot of really cool things that you can learn. Keep up with the blog. That's a great way to keep up with what's going on with the tool. But I'm going to go ahead and hit the X in the top right-hand corner of this. Just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of, hey, here's what's going on here. All right, now, once you get rid of that, this is the Power BI desktop that you will get very familiar with over time. With inside the Power BI desktop, there are a few areas I want to get you a little comfortable with, get you a little familiar with what's going on your screen. As we continue forward, when I tell you to go to this area of the screen or that area of the screen, I want you to know exactly what I'm talking about. So let's do this. I talked about these different phases of a Power BI project before. I want to highlight in the tool where you would find each of those phases. So for example, let me zoom in here for a moment. Oops, try that again. All right, so for example, when you get started with any solution, you're going to begin by going into the Get Data experience right here. So the Get Data button is going to be the first part of any Power BI project that you start with. So that's always going to be your starting point. You'll go to the Get Data section. To go along with the Get Data button, you also have the Transform Data button, and I would say that both of these two buttons together would make up that first phase of our Power BI project that I mentioned earlier, which was that data discovery phase that I talked about earlier. You may also think of this as more of kind of like a data cleansing phase as well. So this is that first step where we're going to go connect to our data and apply any kind of data cleansing steps that we might have. That's all done within that first step here. The second phase, which we talked about, which is a data modeling phase, is primarily going to be done with these two buttons over here, mainly the model button here on the left-hand side. But let's talk about these two for a moment. These two are the data view as well as the model view. Okay, and through these two buttons, this is where you'll go through that second phase of any Power BI project. Let me not zoom in any more than that. There we go. That second phase of any Power BI project is that data modeling. Some people might refer to it as data mashup, not meta, data mashup. And through this phase is where you're going to create relationships between the various tables that you pulled together. This is also where you'll write DAX. So there's a lot of things that go into this phase here. All right, let's also talk about the third phase. So the third phase, which would be done primarily through this button in the top left, this would be the visualization view, or I should say the report view. And the report view is going to be part of that third phase of any one of your Power BI projects. This would be that data visualization, data report development, whatever you want to refer to it as, but this is that data visualization phase of your project. So you're starting to build out reports and dashboards and visuals. That's all done primarily through this little report view that you see on the left-hand side. And the fourth phase, which we mentioned, was kind of that data sharing or sharing step. And that's going to be done not so much on the screen right here. Actually, tell you what, let me actually identify it a little clearer here. It's going to be done through this button that's grayed out right now. So through this Publish button, this is going to be that fourth phase of your project. And that fourth phase of your project is all about sharing. So how to take the results of what you've designed so far and share it with others. Well, you're going to do that by publishing it to what's known as the Power BI service. This is where things like the Power BI subscriptions come into play and the licensing for Power BI comes into play, all at once you start to publish and share with others. Okay? Now you can actually publish to the Power BI service using a free account. That free account doesn't give you a ton of abilities, but you can kind of publish to your own personal My Workspace, and you can kind of test things out there as you're getting some experience with Power BI. But that's kind of the four phases of your Power BI project: connect to your data, model your data, visualize it, and share it with others. Okay? All right, so let me take this off screen. All right, so within inside of the Power BI desktop, we've talked about several of the different areas in here, but again, worth kind of highlighting here that this left side of my screen, these are going to be your views. So we talked about this is your report view, this is your data view, this is your model view. All the views are found on the right-hand side. And the reason I'm sharing some of these things with you is because I'm going to tell you, hey, go to the report view, go to the model view. And when I tell you that, I want you to know what I'm talking about. So on the left-hand side is views. On the right-hand side, these are called panes. So these are your filters pane, your visualization pane, your fields pane. All of these on the right-hand side are going to be panes. So if you hear me say, hey, go to the data, go to your filters pane, or go to my fields pane, this is the area I'm referring to. And then, of course, up on the top here, these are your tabs, or I think the more formal name for them is the Office ribbon, but you might refer to these as ribbons, or probably more common nomenclature here is tabs. So if I tell you to go to the Model tab, or I tell you to go to the Insert tab, this area up top here is really what I'm referring to as far as the different tabs that are available. Okay? All right. So now that we've got some of the layout of the tool out of the way, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of background on where we're going to be clicking and what we're going to be doing, let's actually start to connect to the data source that we pulled in and that we copied a few moments ago. So remember, we went to that FDIC failed bank website that was found right here, and we copied the link. So remember what we did. We right-clicked and we copied this link address, and now we're going to bring it over to the Power BI desktop and use it as a data source. Now, the way that you can do that is you can do that by going up to the Get Data button up in the very top, and I can select Get Data, and then tell Power BI that I want to pull in data from a web source. So here's what I would like you to do if you're following along is you're going to go up to Get Data with inside the Power BI desktop and select Web. And once you do that, it's going to pop open on your screen. I'm delaying a little bit here to give everybody some time to click it. But you're going to select the Web button, and when you choose that, it's going to give you a dialog box where you can paste in the URL that we copied earlier for the failed banks data set. So you can go ahead and do that. I want to show you one more thing before I click on that myself. The one more thing that I want to show you is that you are not limited to just these data sources that you see here. You actually have, if you click on More, don't actually do this, just watch this part. But if I click on More, this will show me a list of all of the data sources that I have available. So look, there are a ton of different data sources that I can connect into. You're not limited to just the ones that you see in that common list. You can actually see there are a ton of different data sources that are available to you here. Definitely worth exploring. Find out which ones are going to be useful to you. But of course, you probably already know, hey, I need to connect into Salesforce, or I need to connect into Dynamics, or I need to connect into SQL Server. If you know the types of data connections you need, you can see if they're available here in this much larger list that they have available. So all I'm trying to do here is just show you, hey, it's a pretty overwhelmingly large list of data connectors that are built in. You can find the larger list. Again, how did I get there? I went up to Get Data, and I selected More. But what I had you do just a moment ago is I had you select Web, and I'm going to go through that same experience that you did as well. Just wanted to show you where you can find that larger list. But for the purposes of what we're going to be doing together, I'm going to go underneath Get Data and select Web, just like I told you to do a few moments ago. Okay, so I'm going to select Web here. Then once I do that, it's going to pop up on my screen where I can paste in the URL that we copied earlier. So again, I think Matt will probably paste into the chat this URL. But that's the URL that we're going to be using as a data source. And again, I can imagine as we go to connect into this, and we have several hundred people that are trying to connect into it, there may be a little bit of a delay, but it's the government. So hopefully the US government's website can handle this. Maybe I'm making some bad assumptions here, but we'll see if we can all connect into this at the same time. So we're going to paste in the URL for our web source. Now, our web source in this case is a CSV file, but you can also point to just a screen of data. So you don't have to point to a file at a URL location. You can actually just point to a regular website that has data embedded on the screen. And Power BI has the ability to do basically like screen scraping and pull the data off of some tabular data that's stored on a website. So there's some really, really neat things that you can do. And you're not limited to just a file type that you can connect into. You can connect into just data stored on a web page. So there's some really cool things you can do there. But for our example, we're going to stick with this CSV file and go ahead and click OK. Now, when we do that, you are likely going to have an extra pop-up that comes up. That did not happen for me. And the reason for that is because, and hang tight, I'm gonna actually produce that on my screen as well. So hang tight where you're at, because you are likely seeing an extra screen here that I did not see. And so I wanna reproduce that. So bear with me for 1 second, because I'm gonna clear this out, because I want you to see the exact same thing I'm seeing. And so the reason I did not see a screen that you saw is because I've connected into this data source before. So let's try it one more time now that I've cleared that out. I'm going to paste that in again and catch back up to you. You're already at that point. Here's the screen that I was expecting you would see that I was not seeing. And so what this screen allows you to do is determine how are you going to authenticate to that source. So am I going to need to sign into that source? Do I need to use Windows credentials? Do I need to use web credentials of some kind? In this case, we're connecting into a public data source, a public web source. And so we are going to connect anonymously. So really, you don't need to do anything here other than click the connect button. I just wanted to make sure that I saw the same button you were seeing. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit connect. And when I hit connect, that's going to connect me in anonymously to that web source. This is now showing us the FDIC failed bank data, a pretty small data set, and I wanted to keep it small for today. But this is showing me a preview of the data that we're about to bring in. Now, as you look in the bottom right-hand corner of this new pop-up, you'll see you have 3 options. I think cancel is pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to explain what cancel does. You guys are pretty smart. You can figure out what cancel does. But let's talk about these other 2 options because these may be unique to you. Now, if you are seeing a different name for transform data, so if you see on my screen it says transform data, but on your screen it says edit, if that's the case for you, then that means you're running, at this point, a very old version of the Power BI desktop. I do recommend updating. You'll be able to follow along just fine for today. They just changed the name of the button, which used to be called transform data, is now, it used to be called edit, is now called transform data. So if yours says edit, you're running an older version. But let's talk about what these 2 options do. If I were to click load, load would allow me to take the data that we see above here. Oops, let's do a square instead. It would allow me to take the data that we see above here, or that way, excuse me, and be able to load it into my Power BI data model. So it'll allow me to take that data in, load it into my data model inside Power BI, and immediately start to build visuals on top of it. So you would choose load if you feel like your data is in pretty good shape already. If you don't need to apply any kind of data cleansing to it, you would choose load because that would take you immediately to start to build out data visualizations. If you feel like you need to fix some of your data, which is probably almost every one of your data sets you connect into, then you would ideally choose the transform data option right here. And so what transform data will allow you to do is it's going to launch open the tool that I named earlier called Power Query. And so by launching Power Query, it gives you the ability to do some data manipulations, to fix your data as you go to bring it in. So if you have some data cleansing or some steps that need to be done to fix your data before you present it, transform data is where you're going to go. And generally speaking, you're going to hit transform data in almost all of your Power BI solutions. So that way you can at least just bring back the columns you need or maybe apply some basic changes to your solution before you go to visualize it. So again, the difference here is load, you don't have any data cleansing that needs to be done. Transform data, is where you're going to go if you have some basic transforms or data cleansing that need to be done. So we're going to learn about in this first hour about that data cleansing step. So let's talk about transform data. I'm going to go ahead and click on transform data here. And when I click on transform data, it's going to launch open what's known as the Power Query Editor. And you can see that it actually launches a separate window. If I minimize this here for a moment, you'll see that I have two windows open. In the background, I have the Power BI desktop. In the foreground, I have the Power Query Editor. And so the Power Query Editor is where you're going to go whenever you need any kind of data cleansing. You can always, by the way, get back to the Power Query Editor if you ever close this by clicking on the Transform Data button here. This will relaunch the Power Query Editor later if you close it by accident or even if you close it on purpose. Clicking Transform Data will relaunch this Power Query Editor that we're looking at. All right, so let me bring this to full screen now. I just wanted to point out the fact that the Power Query Editor, while it's part of the Power BI desktop, launches as a separate window. Anytime you save something for Power Query, it's saved as part of one single Power BI file. There's not separate files for Power Query and Power BI. It's all saved as one single file. It's a PBIX file is the file extension. All right, so within inside of the Power Query Editor, there's a couple things that I want to do to fix my data before I go to present it. Now, the first thing that I recommend you do, I'm usually really bad about remembering my own best practices, but I remembered it this time. My best practice for you to start off with is that you should rename your query something more appropriate. And in this case, you can see that my query name is just called Bank List. I do recommend that you name it something that is more user-friendly. In fact, you can have things like spaces are okay to have in the names of your queries. By the way, the query that we have here is going to turn into a table within inside of our data model. So whatever you name the query here is what the name of the data model table will be. So you have two different places you can go to rename the query. You can go on the left-hand side where it says Queries, and I can double-click on the query name here to rename it. Or the other alternative is you can go on the right-hand side, on the far right, where it says Query Settings, and you can rename your query here as well. And so I can just come here and I can type a new name on top of the old one, and I'm going to rename this one something like just Failed Banks for this example. Okay? By the way, if for some reason you ever lose the query settings pane, if you hit X on it by accident, that happens sometimes. If you ever get rid or lose this little pane on the right-hand side, you can re-add it by going under the View menu. So if I go underneath View up top here, under View, you'll see Query Settings right here, and that will allow you to add it back over there. That'll allow you to add it back if you ever mistakenly close the Query Settings pane. So if I click on this, that'll bring the query settings back visible on my screen here again. Okay? All right. So there's a couple things that I want to do to clean up this data before I go to visualize it. The three things that I'm going to guide you through how to do here is, one, I'm going to remove some columns that we just don't need. And this is a general best practice with Power BI. If there's columns that you are never going to need for any reason within inside of your Power BI solution, you should remove them. Okay? And so that's the first step that I'm going to guide you through is how do you remove columns from a particular data set. Okay? The second thing I'm going to show you is how we can start to learn how to leverage and use various transforms that are available to us. As part of that process, we're also going to learn about data types inside the Power Query Editor and how the transforms that are provided to you inside of Power Query are contextual based on the data types of the columns you have. So that's the second thing we're going to learn is we're going to learn how to transform this closing date column that we see right here. I want to create another column next to it that returns back and parses out the year from the date. Okay, so I want to have a second column here that not only has the date, but this second column will now have the year. Okay, so that's the second transform we're going to do. The third one that we're going to do is going to have to do with the city and state column that we see right here. So the city and state column that we're bringing back right now, they're stored here separately. But one of the things that I would normally ask if this was more of an interactive class is I would ask you, what would be the potential problem with the data being stored like this? Let's say, for example, that I want to combine the city and state together as a single field. Normally, I would ask, if I could see your chat back to me, is I would ask, why would it be beneficial to combine these two columns together? I want to combine city and state together, but I'll go ahead and answer the question myself here today. Is that it's beneficial to combine these two columns together because you oftentimes will have multiple cities, or I should say one city name that can appear in multiple states. So I happen to be from the city of Jacksonville, Florida, and I saw there's quite a few people in the chat a few moments ago that said they're from Jacksonville as well. Hello, fellow Floridians. What benefit I get by combining these two together is when there are cities that appear in multiple states, it makes the value less ambiguous. So it makes it so it's really clear that, hey, we're talking about Jacksonville, Florida, not Jacksonville, North Carolina. Boo, North Carolina. I'm kidding. I'm not going to boo North Carolina. Or if it's Columbus, there's a Columbus, Georgia. There's also a Columbus, Ohio. So how do I make sure that we know which one is which? And there's a couple different ways you can manage this with inside of Power BI. One way is you can combine the fields together. And then there's some other ways on the data visualization side of things that you can manage that as well. But for interest of exploring some of the things you can do with inside the Power Query Editor, I'm going to show you a couple different ways that you can combine those two fields together. All right. So first things first, that's the 3 different transforms we're going to do. Remove some columns, transform our date to a year, and then combine city and state. So the first thing we want to do is we want to remove some columns that we don't need. Now there's a number of ways that you can accomplish this, and you'll find out in the Power Query Editor that there's generally about 3 or 4 different ways you can do the exact same thing with inside a Power Query. And in this scenario, what I'd like to do is I am going to show you a couple different ways, but then I'm going to show you my recommended way of how you remove columns. So don't follow along with these first couple examples. I will tell you when I want you to click along with me. So if you want to remove a column, again, don't do this, but one way you can do it is you can simply right-click on a column, and you can tell it that you want to remove the column. That's one way you can do it. You can also multi-select, and you can remove multiple by multi-selecting and then choosing Remove Column. You can also choose the columns you want to keep. So if I were to choose the columns here that I want to keep, and then right-click, I can select Remove Other Columns, and it would remove all the ones I don't have selected. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. However, my recommended way of dealing with and removing columns is to actually use this option that's found underneath the Home tab or Home ribbon. So make sure you have the Home tab selected. And then you'll find there's this option here called Choose Columns. And the reason why I recommend that you use the Choose Columns option is because when you're working with really large, or I should say really wide data sets, and what I mean by wide is I mean you have a lot of columns. In some cases, maybe you're dealing with a data set that has hundreds of columns, right? I'm sure many of you probably have some pretty gnarly data sets that have hundreds of columns, and in reality, when you go to analyze that data set, you need maybe 10 to 20 of those columns. And so if you were to use that interaction where I right-click on a column and remove it, that would be a pretty arduous process when you have many hundreds of columns. The Choose Columns option is a more efficient way to be able to remove columns. So I'm going to select the Choose Columns option right here that I've been highlighting. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that right here. And when I select Choose Columns, you'll see it'll give me a list of all of the columns I have available here. And I can pick and choose which ones I actually want to keep. Now, in this case, this is a pretty small data set, so I could have really chosen to remove columns in any way that I showed you a few moments ago. But I wanted to get you in the habit of using the Choose Columns feature because when you are working with much wider data sets, meaning, again, many columns, this is the ideal way of doing it. Here you can search for columns. So if I have a big list of hundreds of columns, I can search for them here. You can also just simply come in and uncheck the columns you don't want. So if I don't want closing date, I can uncheck that. Here's actually the columns I want you to uncheck. Go ahead and uncheck Cert and Acquiring Institution. And that's what we're going to do. So go ahead and do that with me. But I can uncheck the columns I don't need. And then when I have those columns unchecked, I can go ahead and click on OK on the bottom. I'm going to keep this on the screen here for a few extra seconds, so make sure you're able to follow along. But again, make sure you rewind if you miss something I do. You can always rewind the video. But once I've unchecked those 2 columns, I'll go ahead and click OK. And that will remove the columns that I don't need. As I apply these various data transforms, including removing columns, that's a data transform here, as I remove the columns, you will see on the far right in the Query Settings pane above me here that there is an Applied Steps section that lists all of the data transforms that we do. So above me, you'll see that each of the data transforms that I apply, whether it be removing a column or changing the data type of a column, all of those steps are going to be found here. And if you ever realize that you make a mistake and you need to undo something, you'll click the little the little X that appears to the left of the transform or the step to be able to undo that prior step. You can also, in some cases, you can edit these steps as well. If you see that little gear icon above me, using that gear icon, that will allow you to edit a step. If you want to change the settings, or in this case, change the columns that I'm returning, I can use that little edit step. If there's a step here that does not have the little gear icon, then that means that you can't edit it. You just have to remove it and redo it if you made a mistake. So like this one above it doesn't have a gear icon. That means you cannot edit that step. All right, cool. So we removed the columns that we don't need, which was just those two columns, the acquiring institution column and the cert column. The next thing that I want to do is I want to parse out the year from the date here. So closing date here, I have that. I want to take this column and I want to add another column next to it that returns back a year. So if I want to do something like that, then I recommend first, I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate of the column because I want to keep the original column. I want that original column to stay there, but I want to have a new column that returns back the year from it. So the first thing I want you to do to be able to do our step number 2 here is we're going to right-click on closing date. So right-click on closing date here with me. And we're going to select that we want to duplicate the column. Okay, so we're going to make a copy or a duplicate of the column. By the way, if you happen to notice the word copy up at the top, that's different. What that copy does at the top, well, it'll actually copy out the data that's stored in this column and allow you to go copy and paste it into like Excel or something like that. So that's not what we want to do. We don't want to copy the data. We actually want to duplicate the column. So go ahead and select that with me here, and then you'll have a duplicate column that's created right next to it. All right, so let's spend a few moments here talking about data types. You can see the data types of your columns if you look in the top right hand, I guess the top left hand corner of each of your column headers. You'll see this little indicator here showing you the data types of your columns. So you can see next to my state column, I can see ABC, which indicates that it's a text column. You can see a little calendar icon to the top left hand corner of my closing date column that indicates that it's a date. And then if you were dealing with whole numbers, you'd see 1, 2, 3, and you can actually see if you click on the little icon or the indicator here in the top left, this will show you all of the data types that you have available within inside of the Power Query Editor. So you can change data types here if you wanted to, but the main reason why I'm bringing up data types right now is I want you to be aware that depending on the data types of your columns, you do get different transforms that are available. Okay, so don't follow along for this for a moment. I just want to show you this. When I go to right-click on the state column, and I go down to transform, you'll see that the types of transforms that are listed here are ones that are specific to text. So I can do things like uppercase my columns or my values. I can capitalize each word. These are all things that are specific to text columns. However, when I go to right-click on my closing date column here, let's zoom in on this one more time. When I go to right-click on my duplicate or my closing date column copy, go ahead and follow me along with this time. If I right-click on this column, that's the closing date copy column, and I go down to transform. This time, you'll notice that I get transforms that are contextual based on the fact that this is a date data type. And so the types of transforms that you can do, again, are contextual based on the data types you're dealing with. So what I want to do with this one is I want to take the closing date copy column, and I want to, let me take myself off screen for a moment. I want to convert this into a year, and then convert it into a year again. So you're going to select year and then year a second time for making this return back just the year by itself. These other ones will actually return back a date, like the first day of the year or the last day of the year. We want to return back just the year by itself. So I'll go ahead and select that, and look what it does. So it parsed out the year from the date here. It's able to return back very easily a parsed out version or a parsed out view of the data here, okay? So that's how you can convert a date to a year here. Now you can also very easily rename the columns. You'll also notice, by the way, here that it did change the data type of the column. You can see the little indicator in the top left shows 1, 2, 3, meaning it's brought it back as a whole number now. That's fine. We'll leave that alone here for now. It's actually going to uncover some problems later that I want to show you. Well, let's go ahead and rename this column. To rename a column, you can either right-click on it and go down to rename. That's one way you can do it. Or my preferred little shortcut here is you can just double-click on the column header. So if I double-click on the column header, I can give it a new name just by typing on top of the old one. So if I rename this year, I can type on top of it right here. Okay? All right, so that's our first 2 steps. Remember, we had 3 steps. We wanted to remove some columns. We've already done that. We wanted to parse out the year from the date. We just did that. My last step, which I should highlight here, if you look above me, notice the applied step section is starting to build out, right? We're starting to have multiple steps that are appearing here. Every one of the transforms that we do adds to this list of applied steps. And we're about to add to it a little bit more, because what we're going to do in this next step is we want to combine my city and state together. So I want to combine and be able to see Fort Walton Beach, comma, Florida, that sort of thing. Now, there's a couple different ways you can do this. Like I mentioned a couple times, there's usually 3 or 4 different ways you can accomplish the same thing with inside the Power Query Editor. One way you can do this, don't follow me on this first example. This first example is you could multi-select, again, don't follow me on this, you could multi-select the city and then hold Control and select year. And if you right-click, you could tell it that you want to merge those columns together. That's one way you could do this. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way, but I want to show you a little special way that's a little different. And the reason why I want to show it to you in this different way is because it's going to expose you and maybe give you some ideas of some other things that you can do with it as you learn more about working with inside of Power BI and more specifically the Power Query Editor. All right, so this different way that I want to show you can be found by going underneath the Add Column ribbon up on the top. So go find the Add Column ribbon or tab up on the very top part of your screen, and you're going to go ahead and expand or select Add Column. And then we're going to choose this option. I'm going to zoom in on this for a moment. We're going to choose this option here called Column from Examples. That's the very first option in the top left. We're going to go ahead and select Column from Examples. And then for this scenario, select from all columns, okay? Very briefly, what from selected columns or what from selection would do is if you had multiple columns that are very similar to each other, say for example, I had a bill to and a ship to address, and so I had multiple cities and states in there, I could choose which columns I wanted to base this new feature that I'm doing on. So I'm jumping a little ahead here. Let me pause for a moment and tell you exactly what we're doing with this feature. What the Column from Examples feature will do, and what I'm going to have you select here in a moment, is from all columns. But what this feature will allow you to do is provide Power BI an example of what you want the end result to look like, and then Power BI will figure out what transforms are required to be able to accomplish the thing you're trying to do. So, for example, if I'm trying to combine the city and state together, I can give it an example where I can type in Jacksonville, Florida, and it will figure out what transforms need to be done to be able to accomplish that. And the reason why I want to show you this method is because when you are new to Power Query, when you're new to Power BI and you're trying to learn about this data cleansing tool, having this feature where you can create new columns from examples is huge because it will teach you a lot about how to work with the tool, because it will show you what's happening behind the scenes whenever it finds the pattern of what you're trying to do and it interprets it into a transform. So again, if you're following along, we're going to select Column from Examples and then select from all columns. Okay, so we'll select from all columns here. When I do that, on the right-hand side of my screen, you'll see, and it's actually above me right now, you'll see that there's this new blank column that's now visible here. And in this blank column, this is where you will fill in an example of what you want to return back. And you're basing it off of what you see in each of the rows. So for example, I can pick any random row here. If I wanted to, I can go to Newark, New Jersey here, this row. And if I click double click within inside of this cell, I can type in an example. Let me take myself off screen for a moment. I can type in an example of what I want this to look like, and it will produce the results for me. So to give you an example, I can type in Newark. And by the way, you can use the IntelliSense here. If you use your up and down arrows, you can do that here and hit enter, or you can just type it in. Either way works. But I can type in Newark, New Jersey with a space. And if I hit enter on that, check out what happens. Boom. It produces a value for every one of the rows that we have in here based on the sample I gave it. I fed in an example of what I wanted the data to look like, and then Power BI or Power Query here was able to interpret the pattern of the data manipulation that we're doing, and it actually created, if you look up on the top here, it created a transform called text.combine where it combined those two fields together. Now this is a very simple example. Combining two columns together is not very difficult. But as you have more complex transforms, using the add column from example is a great way to learn how to manipulate data with inside a Power Query, because what happened behind the scenes when I did this, if we go look at our applied steps section, I need to hit OK before we can see this. You can see it's kind of grayed out right now. We'll hit OK. Go ahead and hit OK here with me. As long as you got the same pattern I got, go ahead and hit OK. And if you have a typo, you can just type on top of it. But you can see in this applied steps section here now, it interpreted the example that we provided into a merge column transform. So it added a step here, it inserted a merge column here as a new transform for us. So leveraging and using the add column from example is a great learning experience when you're new inside of the Power Query Editor. All right, we also want to rename this column, and we are inching towards our first break of the day here, but we're going to go ahead and rename this column. Instead of calling it merged, I'm going to double click on the column header, and we're going to instead name it city. Let's try that again. Double click, and we're going to rename this city state, and I'll hit enter. All right, so we've got everything kind of put together here. We did the 4 steps. I'm going to zoom out for a moment and full screen this again. We've done the 3 transforms we wanted to do. Okay, we removed columns we didn't need. We then converted or created a new column with the year. And then this final step, we use the add column from examples feature to be able to create this new combined city and state. And again, as a reminder, how I did that, you can always rewind. So make sure you know. You can rewind the little YouTube viewer here to go back and see how I did that again. But what we did as a quick reminder is we went up to column from example, we selected from all columns, and then you provide an example of what you want the data to look like, and then it produces a transform for you. So really, really cool and powerful stuff. All right, so what do you do next? Let's say you've done all of the data cleansing that you need to do, and you're ready to move on, right? You feel like this looks pretty good now at this point. Your next step then is you would select underneath the Home tab. So you need to go back up to the top left of your screen underneath the Power Query Editor. You'd select Home, so make sure you have Home selected. And then in the top left, you'll see the option called Close and Apply. And that's actually what we're going to select here in just a moment, but I want to explain what that means. What close and apply means is it's physically going to close the Power Query Editor. So the window that we have open right now, this Power Query Editor is going to be closed. And then what apply means is it's going to take the results of the Power Query Editor and apply it or load it into our Power BI data model. So the data is going to be brought in from this CSV file stored on the web, and it's going to apply it into our data model. So go ahead and select that. Go ahead and select Close and Apply. And if you see this little drop down come, hit Close and Apply a second time. And that's going to close the Power Query Editor. And this part, by the way, because we do have potentially hundreds of people that are doing this at the same time, it worked fast for me because I have a little delay. I'm about 30 seconds ahead of you. But you may see a little delay with it loading all that data in because we have hundreds of people that are trying to click that Close and Apply button at the same time. But what happened when we did that is it brought all of the data that we had from that CSV file stored on the web, and it brought it into our data model. And you can see on the right-hand side of my screen, right above me, that we have now in our fields list a list of all of the fields that we were working with inside of our Power Query Editor. So this is kind of our first step with inside of any Power BI project, is really focused in on getting your data in, applying data cleansing, and then bringing it into your data model. So we're through that first phase now. We're about a third of the way through our stream here. So let's go ahead and take a short, very short, 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to continue forward and start to dig into our data modeling components. All right, so we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Get a quick drink. 3 hours is too long to keep going straight for either for you or for me. So let's take a quick 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we will continue forward and learn more about the data modeling components of Power BI. See you in 5 minutes. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us again this morning. Welcome back. In our next section, we're going to begin to dive into the data modeling components of Power BI. Now, obviously, we spent, maybe 30, 45 minutes on the data cleansing part. You could spend a lot more time on that. There's a lot of other interesting things to cover in there. One thing I did happen to notice in the chat, as a lot of great questions. Matt, you're doing a great job kind of keeping up with that. One thing I did notice that was a great question was around if I have a much larger data set. So in the data set we're working with, it's considerably small. It's less than 1,000 rows. I kind of intentionally did that to hopefully have where everyone could follow along fairly easily. I know we sounds like we brought down the government's website because Matt was telling me that the site was down temporarily. Should be back up now. But the idea here is that when you're working with inside the Power Query Editor, you are working with a sampling of your data. So let me show you this real quickly. If we go back over to the Power BI desktop, we were working with inside the Power Query Editor. Again, as you might remember, I told you you can always relaunch the Power Query Editor if you want to look at it again, and you don't need to follow along for this. I'm just kind of showing you something. But if you ever want to go back to the Power Query Editor to make additional changes or additional manipulations, you can do that by clicking the Transform Data button up in the top, and that will relaunch the Power Query Editor again. And one of the questions that we oftentimes get is, what if I'm working with a really large data set? Now, inside the Power Query Editor, this only brings back the first 1,000 rows of any data set you're working with. And the reason why it does that is the Power BI team has designed the Power Query Editor to be as responsive as possible. Is that they've designed this so that if you go to click on something and you go to right-click on or interact with or apply a transform, the responsiveness is going to be really peppy, right? That's kind of the idea of what the Power Query Editor is designed to do, is not only to transform data, but be very responsive to the users. And you'll be able to tell if you look in the very bottom left-hand corner down here, this will actually show you the number of rows that you're working with inside of the Power Query Editor. So if I had millions of rows in my data set, Power BI can handle millions of rows. But when you're working with inside of the Power Query Editor, it only brings in the first 1,000 rows to do your data manipulation on. And again, the purpose for that is to make the tool still be responsive, to be able to return back results very quickly. And then what happens is after you create your business rules with inside of the Power Query Editor, when you go to hit that Close and Apply button, remember that was the last thing we did before we wrapped up? Whenever you go to hit this Close and Apply button, it's going to apply your business rules or your transforms to the entire data set. So even though it only applies them to the first 1,000 rows when you start, when you go to hit Close and Apply, it's going to apply your business rules and your transforms to the millions of rows that you have within your data set. So I saw that question pop up. It's a common one I wanted to make sure I address. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about is our data model. So our data model is the part of your Power BI solution where you begin to bring in multiple tables, you create relationships between those tables, and it really kind of gets into more of the ultimate design of your solution. And this is a really important part of your Power BI solution, and oftentimes a very underestimated part. One of the things that we do at Pragmatic Works, and I want to share this with you here in a few moments as well, but one of the things that we do at Pragmatic Works is mentoring, where we actually mentor and work with individuals that are having problems with Power BI. We can actually sit with you and walk you through a DAX problem or walk you through a data modeling problem. And the number one thing that we find in those mentoring sessions is where individuals have a poorly designed data model. And it's not their fault, they just didn't know. They didn't know the kind of things that go into a data model and a good design of a data model. And so there are some things to consider. We're obviously in a short amount of time not going to be able to go through every different element of a great data model design, but this section is an underestimated part of Power BI. That's kind of my point there, is that this is something that you obviously will want to learn a lot more about. Now, speaking of learning more, obviously today's class is just a 3-hour class, really kind of getting you into Power BI, getting you familiar with the tool. But what do you do after today? Now, this is recorded, obviously. This is on YouTube, and whenever we do streams on YouTube, you'll be able to rewatch this session over and over. But if you are interested in learning more beyond what we have to cover today, Pragmatic Works is here for you, right? We are a training company. That is our sole focus. We really follow the mantra of we want to teach you how to fish. We want to teach you how to do it yourself. Because when it comes to tools like Power BI and Power Apps and Power Automate and Power Virtual Agents, these tools are designed for you to be able to solve these problems on your own. And so if you are looking for additional assistance after today, I highly recommend that you take a look at our on-demand learning. Now, our on-demand learning, we actually have a special sale for those of you that are attending today to be able to get it for 75% off. That's unusually low for our on-demand learning. We have a great sale. In fact, I'll bring this up on my screen here so you can see. I'm not trying to sales pitch you too much, but we do have this offering that I want to make sure you're aware of. So after today's class, and actually you can do it today even, if you go to our website, pragmaticworks.com, and add to your cart the on-demand unlimited package. If you type in the event code or the coupon code, event75, that will give you 75% off of our on-demand learning. And this deal will run through next Tuesday, so you have plenty of time. We'll obviously follow up email, give you some more information on this. If you're interested, that's a great way to go beyond some of the basics because, like I said, I'm not going to be able to make you an expert in this 1 3-hour course, but we have, as part of our on-demand learning, 18 different Power BI classes. So we go well beyond the basics of what we're covering today in our on-demand learning. I highly encourage you to take a look at that. As part of our on-demand learning, we have courses that go into showing you the full spectrum of Power BI, like our Introduction to Power BI course. We have an Advanced Power BI course. We have specific data modeling and DAX courses. We have 2 different DAX courses, which I highly, highly recommend. Mitchell Pearson taught those. Many of you have attended classes with Mitchell Pearson. Don't tell him don't tell him that I think so, but he's pretty good. See, he is a big part of our on-demand learning. I definitely would recommend taking a peek at those. But in addition to our on-demand learning, we do have other ways that we deliver training as well. Again, we are all about, we want to teach you how to fish, teach you how to do it yourself. And again, we do that through our on-demand learning, which you can see on the far left. We also do live instructor-led boot camps, which you can find on our website as well. So we have a week-long Power BI boot camp or a 4-day-long Power BI boot camp and a 3-day-long DAX boot camp. And we have Power Apps and Power Platform boot camps that might interest you. We deliver those boot camps both privately as well as publicly. So if you have, maybe your company needs, maybe you have 10 people of your own that you want to attend a boot camp, we do those privately. We also do hackathons. And hackathons are kind of the idea of, hey, I attend a class and everything works perfectly in a class, Devin, right? Everything always works perfectly when you attend a class and you go through the labs. But when you go back to do this on your own at your own desk, things don't always work exactly the way that they're supposed to. And so hackathons are our idea of being able to allow you to do a training class, but on your own data. And so it's still a training exercise, it's still a learning exercise, but we're at the end goal of a hackathon is to be able to build out a proof of concept that's based on your data rather than just going through sample data we have. So that's a great solution. We also do enterprise customized training. So if you're an organization that has hundreds, if not maybe even thousands of users that need Power BI training, we have some customizations for that. And what we do is we really realize that everyone learns in different ways. Some people can learn through web-based training that's recorded. Some people need a live instructor. And so we really have a customized package to be able to train your group in whatever their preferred manner is, because everybody learns differently. I think you guys realize that. Some people learn in different ways. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention here before we move on is our architect mentoring. And our mentoring is with the design to be able to have some one-on-one time with one of our instructors where you can show them the problem that you're having and kind of get some guidance on how to get past it. So the architect mentoring is one-on-one time. You can purchase by the hour. You don't have to purchase weeks at a time like you would with normal consulting. You can purchase by the hour with a minimum of 3-hour purchase, and then you can spend time with one of our trainers on getting some guidance on how to push further along and get past those roadblocks you're having. So the big thing for today, though, and again, I apologize, I know everyone loves to hear about what we want to try and show you later, but the big thing that I want to focus you in on, of course, is that on-demand sale. That on-demand learning is those courses we keep up to date. We re-record them when necessary. I highly recommend you take a look at it, and you can, of course, purchase online using the coupon code EVENT75. That'll get you 75% off of our on-demand learning. So make sure you take a peek at that. That sale is going to go on through next Tuesday. All right, let's get back into what we've been discussing. So thank you for bearing with me on that. Now, what we're going to take a look at next is how do we add some additional tables to our data model? What kind of tables would we add? What are some of the things that we might find necessary as part of our data model creation? And what we're going to start off with is we're going to create a second table as part of our data model. Right now we just have the one. You can see the one above me here, the failed banks table. And you can just zoom in on that so you can see it here. We could actually start to build out report visuals right now if we wanted based on this table. It's ready to go. But I want to add in some additional tables to it. But just to show you, I could actually start to build out visuals right now. If I wanted to, I could bring in a visual, and I'm going to highlight and show you more detail on how to do the visuals here in a few moments, so don't get too hung up on that I'm not going to show you the details of this yet. But I'm going to bring in a basic visual here and say, hey, I want to see the number of failed banks by state. And maybe kind of a surprise to some, Georgia is the state that has the most failed banks. Now, I created that visual really quickly, and I know I didn't show you how I did it. I'm going to show you that later. But I wanted to get you an idea of showing you the fact that this is not that difficult to do. It's all drag and drop. I want you to feel comfortable with it. And I know I did this one fast, but I'm going to show you how to create these visuals here in a few moments after we go through the data modeling components. But you can build visuals immediately. After you get done with the Power Query Editor, you can start to build out your visuals right away. And I'm already getting answers to which state has the most failed banks here rather quickly. All right, so here's what I'd like to do is I want to add in a second table to be able to enhance our model. I deleted that visual. We're going to come back to visuals later. But I want to add in a second table into my data model because I actually have some needs to be able to analyze by various dates inside of my organization. And what you'll find with most of BI solutions that you might work with, it's oftentimes common that you would have a separated table for your dates. Now, you might notice I have a closing date column. You likely saw that before. I have a closing date column here that's inside of the table that we've been working in. But there are some benefits to having a separated out, separate date table. I'm sure many of you worked with fiscal calendars, so you might want to have a separate date table to be able to analyze things over a fiscal calendar versus a regular calendar, calendar where the date starts in January, the year starts in January and ends in December. Maybe you have a fiscal calendar where your year starts in July and ends in June. So there's some benefits to having a date table. In fact, another benefit might be that you want to analyze and understand how well your organization does, let's say if you're retail, how well you do on weekends versus weekdays, or how well you do on holidays if you're open for holidays. So there's a lot of benefits to having a date table. And those are some of the benefits I just listed here. So I want to show you how you can add a date table inside of your solutions that you're working on as well. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can add in date tables. You can add in a date table from your data source. So if the data source you're working with has a date table, then you can add it directly in from your data source. Another way is, and I'm kind of searching this on the side, actually Matt will be able to post this in the chat. I'm searching it like I'm going to show it to you, but I can't copy and paste in the chat. Another way that you can create a date table is with a Power Query script. Okay, so what I'm showing you right here, this is a blog that I have that Matt, if you can share that with Julia so she can share it to everyone. This is a blog that I have that actually walks you through how to create a date table inside of Power Query. This is actually my preferred way to do it. But I want to show you and start to expose you into more data modeling features in this section. So what we're going to do together is we're going to create a date table by writing DAX. And there's a lot of different ways you can create date tables. I'm just mentioning 3 different ways here. Again, those 3 ways are pull one in from your data source. It could be create one inside of Power Query, which is what's on my screen here on the right. And then the third way is that you could actually create a new date table by writing DAX. And that's probably the easiest way for us to do one all together. So we're going to stick to that method for what we're doing today. All right, so for this section, what I'd like you to do is we're going to work our way over to the data view. Now, if you remember, I talked about we have a report view, data view, model view. You can find the data view on the left-hand side right here. So go ahead and select the data view with me as we go through this next part of our example. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select that as well. I'm going to click on the data view. And then from the data view, we're going to create a new table. Okay, this is not the only place you can create this new table, but it's probably the most ideal place because you can see the results of the table. That's what the data view does. The data view shows you the data behind your tables. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a new date table. And we can do that by going up to the Table Tools tab up top, which is already shown to me. And then we're going to select the New Table button underneath that Table Tools ribbon. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select New Table. And then with that selected, you'll notice that it basically gives me a blank design surface where I can start to write a DAX expression. DAX, again, as a reminder, is the data analysis expression language. And this is where I want to give you a little peek into what you can do with DAX. Just a brief peek into it. We're not going to be able to get too deep into it. We did do a Learn with the Nerds previously on DAX. That's one that Mitchell Pearson did. I highly recommend you go back and watch that one again if you're interested in getting deeper into DAX. That one is recorded on our YouTube channel, and you can go back and watch it at any point. Don't leave me now, but later on, you'll want to watch that DAX 3-hour session that Mitchell Pearson did, a really good session. I'm going to get you just a brief understanding of DAX. He went across 3 hours, covered nothing but DAX. All right. So by creating and clicking on this new table button, this allows us to create and write a DAX expression that will define and create a new table for us. So I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see this a little better. Okay. And I'm going to create a new table by naming the table to the left of the equal sign. So everything to the left of the equal sign is going to be the name of your table, and everything to the right of your equal sign is going to be the definition of what makes up that table. So if I want to go ahead and rename this table, I can change it from being called table. Let's call it instead calendar. Okay? And then to the right of the equal sign, we're going to define the name, not define, but we're going to define the calculation that's going to return back our list of dates for us. So we're going to use a special function within inside of DAX known as calendar auto. It's a really cool function that if you go down here, you'll find it. And you can see the description that it's right above me. It shows you a description of what this function does. It says it returns a table with one column that's automatically created a list of dates from my data model. So what the calendar auto function is going to do is it's going to look for any date columns that we already have in our data set. So we have a closing date column already. And then what calendar auto is going to do is it's going to produce a range of dates in this new table based on that closing date column that we already have. So it's trying to automatically create this list of dates for me based on what's in my model. That's kind of the benefit of calendar auto. If I were to choose calendar, the one above it, that is another function that does something similar, but instead of it automatically producing the list of dates, I would have to provide a start date and an end date for it. All right? So in this case, we're going to use the calendar auto function. Let me go ahead and slide over here so you can see. And using the IntelliSense here, you can actually start to type in things like type in the word calendar. And as I type calendar or type in calendar auto, the IntelliSense will help me out. And I can hit the tab key on my keyboard, and it will populate out that function for me. So if I want to use calendar auto, I can start to type it and leverage the IntelliSense to be able to fully write out the whole name of the expression. Now, some DAX expressions have optional parameters. This is actually a scenario here of a calculation or a formula that has an optional parameter. And you can tell it's optional because it has these little brackets around it here in the template. When you see these little brackets around the template, that indicates that those are optional parameters for this data set. And the optional parameter in this case is I could pass in when the end of my year is, so what's the last month of my year, and that would allow me to build out a fiscal calendar here if I wanted to. I'm not so much worried about building a fiscal calendar in this scenario, but just know you can. You can build out a fiscal calendar using DAX here. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to do a close parentheses. Since that's an optional parameter, I can skip it. And then I'm going to hit enter. And notice what happens when I do that. It creates this list of dates for me based on the dates that are already inside of my data model. Okay, so what calendar auto did is it created that list of dates. All right. The next thing I want to do is I want to build on some additional columns on top of this data set, on top of this new table, this calendar table. By the way, you'll notice that even though I named the table calendar, it automatically creates my first column and names it date. So table is called calendar, column is called date, and you'll also see that, by the way, if I go over to the far right, you'll see that above me that I have a table called calendar and I have a column called date. Okay, so that's what's created whenever we create that calendar auto function, and I named the table calendar. All right, so what I'd like to do next is we're going to add a couple other columns in here. I want to add in a column that returns back maybe the month, and one that returns back the year, and one that returns back maybe the month number, and things like that in here. So we're going to add in another new column. You'll see there's another up in the Table Tools tab on the top. We're going to select that we want to add in another new column here. So I'm going to select the New Column button. from the Table Tools ribbon right here. So if I select and click on New Column, it's going to create another new column for me. And again, if I go too fast for you in any section, make sure you just hit the little back button in the YouTube player and you'll be able to go back and watch it again. But I'm going to go ahead and name this new column Year. So as a reminder, whatever's to the left of the equal sign is going to be the name of the object. To the right of the equal sign is the definition of that object. So I'm going to name this one Year. And then to the right of it, I'm going to define it by using a DAX expression known as year. Now this part is going to be feel very familiar to those of you that are pretty comfortable with Excel formulas. So if you work with Excel formulas and you've ever used the year function within inside of Excel formulas, it works basically the same. So it's going to let me parse out the year from the date. Now, I mentioned that not to make you think that all DAX formulas are exactly the same as Excel formulas, but there are a lot of similarities with some of the formulas. They're not exactly the same, but there are some similarities, and that's done by design because the Power BI team wants those of you that have that experience already in Excel to feel somewhat comfortable as you start to work your way into DAX. It's not exactly the same. There are going to be areas that get more complicated, but there's a lot of similarities as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and type in and use the year function by hitting the tab key on the IntelliSense. That will populate in the year function. You can also just type it if you want. And then you'll notice that the year function, if I look at the template, it's expecting for me to pass in my date column into the year function. So if I want to pass in the date column, here's how you can do it. There's a couple different ways. There's some shortcuts. So those of you that are already familiar with this, show me a little grace here because you might already know some of this stuff I'm about to show you. But when you go to type in a reference to another column within inside of your data model, there's a couple different ways you can do it. One way you can do it is you can refer to the table name first. So I can type in and say, hey, bring back from my calendar table, and tell it that I want to bring back my date column from the calendar table. So if I hit tab on the IntelliSense, that's the pop down here that shows me all my values, it will allow me to return back my date column from my calendar table. The other thing to be aware of, though, is when you're working with inside the calendar table already. So I'm already in the calendar table. If I'm already in the calendar table, this reference to the table name is optional. So I could remove this out of here and it will still work. So just letting you know that, you might have some best practices you like to follow where you like to keep the table name in there. If that's you, that's all good. You can do that. But do know that the table reference is optional when you're working with inside the table that you're creating the column, which I am doing that in this case. So I'm going to just tell it that I want to return back the year from my date column, and I'll do a close parentheses here. And when I do that, I'll hit enter. And that will create this year column for me where I can see the year parsed out from the date. Kind of similar to what we did with inside the Power Query Editor earlier, remember? And as I scroll down here, you'll be able to see that the year does change. As I scroll down to the next year, you'll see it changes to 2001, and it'll change to 2002 and 2003 where appropriate. But that's how you can create an additional column on top of your, in this case, calculated table. So this is all done using DAX. And again, we're just going to be scratching the surface of DAX here today. There's a lot more in-depth ways that you can understand DAX. Our training is a great way to get more in-depth. I definitely recommend looking at our on-demand Introduction to DAX and Advanced DAX courses. All right, we're going to add in another column. We're going to add in two more columns. The next one that we're going to add in, we're going to go back up to Table Tools again. So work your way back up to Table Tools. And then we're going to select New Column again. Okay, so Table Tools, then New Column. Okay, when I select New Column, that's going to give me another blank column that we can start to define by writing our DAX formula to tell it what we want to return back. And in this case, what I'd like to return back is the month number. So let me go ahead and type in that as the name of my column. I'm going to call this column month number. And then to the right of the equal sign, we're going to leverage a similar function to what we did earlier, but not use the year function. Instead, we're going to use a function called month. Now, one thing that's kind of neat about DAX is DAX has all sorts of functions that tie into doing things like accounting and finance. You'll see next to me here that there's all kinds of like ending balance and opening balance. There's all sorts of different types of functions. I should say closing balance. There's all sorts of different functions that you'll likely find that will be very useful to you as you get deeper and more in depth into DAX. For this example, though, all I want is the simple month function. I just want to highlight there's a lot of different ways that you can analyze your data by dates as you get further along in DAX. But I'm going to use the month function here. I'll hit Tab on my IntelliSense to bring back month. And then this time I'm going to go ahead and bring back the date column again. And then I'll do a close parentheses. All right, so simple little function here just to parse out the month from the date. Now, you might notice that I named it month number, and the reason why I named this month number is because that's exactly what's going to return back. It's going to return back the number of the month. It's not returning back the name of the month. So if you kind of look, if I scroll down here, you can see that it's returning back 1, 2, 3, 4 instead of January, February, March, April. But I really want both. I want to have not only the month number, but also the month name to return back. So we're going to create one more calculated column. Hopefully you're hanging in there with me. But we're going to create one more calculated column, and I can do that by going up to the new column option right here again. So we're going to select new column. And in this new column, this one we're going to call just month by itself. Okay? In this one, we're going to return back the name of the month. So we're going to return back January, February, March, April, May, so on and so forth. Okay? Now this function is a little bit different, and it's actually a really cool function. I think you'll like this one, because what we're going to leverage in this function, and Matt, I know you have a great resource for this one, so if you want to get that handy and ready to share here shortly. But what we're going to use in this function is, what we're going to use in this formula is the format function. And what the format function will allow us to do is to return back different formats of our dates. And it's not just limited to dates. You can actually do this with some other things as well. But the format function will allow us to return back different formats of our dates. So if we want to return back, let's say, the spelled out month name, we can use the format function to do that. So I'm going to select and use the format function. It's going to prompt us to pass in a value into it. And our value in this case is our date column. So I'm going to pass in the date column into my format function. And then we're going to hit a comma to tell it what kind of format that we want to use. Now, Matt has a great resource. It's a Microsoft doc that has all of the different types of formats you can pass in. But let me give you a few examples of what we can do here. So Matt, if you can share that or have Julia share that, I'm going to pass in and show that I want to see the date spelled out. So if I want to see the date spelled out, I can do 4 lowercase m's like that in double quotes and close parenthesis here. And that will return back the spelled out month name. So you can see here it's spelled out the month instead of just displaying the month number. You can also change this around. So that's using 4 lowercase m's, but let's say I use 3 lowercase m's. And by the way, we're going to stick with the 4 lowercase m's one, so just watch what I do after this. What we're going to end up doing is what you see on the screen right now, but I want to show you some of the other things you can do as well. But if I do 3 lowercase m's, this will bring back something like a month abbreviation. And then you can start to get really creative. Check this out. I can do 3 lowercase m's with something like 4 lowercase y's, and that will bring me back a month abbreviation with a year. Pretty cool. I like that. You could also do something like this. Check this out. If I wanted to, instead, let's say I wanted to bring back something like the day of the week. I could do 4 lowercase d's, and it'll bring back the day of the week. So if I'm trying to figure out how well we did on the Saturday and Sunday versus the weekdays, there's how you can kind of build out to that. You can also do other things here. So if I wanted to do like 3, so let's say 2 lowercase d's, that'll give me something like the day of the month. Okay, so that's pretty good as well. But again, in this scenario here, what I'd like to see is I want to have the 4 lowercase m's to return back the month name. All right, so that's what we're trying to do for this scenario. And that's it for our date table. We created these 4 columns. We use the format function in this one. The format function here in this case returned back a parsed out month name that we're leveraging and using for this. And this is going to come back into play later. The reason why I return back the month number and the month name, I'm kind of setting us up for something later that will hopefully make sense once we get to it. You might be asking, well, why do I need the month number and the month name? There is a reason. We're going to get to it here shortly. All right, so we're done in the data view. Nothing else I really need to do in the data view. What we're going to flip over to now is we're going to go back over to the report view. That's the one right here. So follow me if you're following along. Go back and click on the report view to switch back over to where we designed the report. And as a reminder, if I went too fast during any of those sections, feel free to rewind our YouTube stream here, and you can go back and see any parts that you might have missed. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and select the report view. And from the report view, we are going to start to design a few reports. Now, I am purposely making a mistake, but it's a common mistake that oftentimes folks that are new to Power BI run into. So I'm purposely making this mistake because what you'll find a lot of times when you go to build out your report visuals is they expose data modeling mistakes. And so I want to show you the experience that you might actually have as you begin to build out your solutions so you know what to do when you run into these same problems that I'm about to run into. Okay, so that's kind of the purpose why some of you might be like, oh, didn't you miss something? I did it on purpose, and I want to show you how you would realize that mistake is happening and then how to fix the mistake. So like I said, a lot of times when you're building out your report visuals, those report visuals will expose issues with your data model. And so what I want to show you here first is a report visual that will expose an issue with our data model. So to do that, I do need to highlight here a little bit on how you create report visuals. To create a report visual, you would select from the visualizations pane right above me, you would select the visual that you want to use. So say, for example, I want to leverage a column chart. I can select the column chart. This is one of the column charts. This is the stack column chart. I can select the stack column chart just by clicking the little icon here. And that will bring the stack column chart on my design surface. You can see it in the top left-hand corner of my screen. And you can grab that column chart, move it around. You can also resize it by grabbing and clicking the little anchor points. So you'll see these little anchor points that are listed around the corners of, in the middle as well, of your design surface. Those little anchor points, if you grab them, that will allow you to resize your report visuals. So if I grab this, I can kind of grab it and resize it however I want. Now what I'd like to do is I'm going to grab this column chart and move it to the right so when I'm zoomed in we can see what I'm doing at the same time you can also see the results. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize my filters pane here and make it so you can really see this well as we start to work with it. So if I wanted to bring in some fields into this new visual, then I can go over to my field list on the right hand side. Let me take myself off the screen for a moment. I can go to my fields list on the right-hand side, and I can start to drag and drop in the fields into this new column chart that we just added. And again, you can see the column chart is selected because you see those anchor points around it. If you ever click in the background of your report, Power BI thinks that you want to create a new visual. So anytime you're trying to edit the visual, make sure you have it selected first to be able to actually edit it. All right. So let's go ahead and add a few new data points to this visual and a few new fields to this visual. To add in some fields into this visual, I'm going to go over to my fields list and I'm going to find my month column and I'm going to go ahead and add my month column to the axis. And you'll notice that all I'm doing is I'm dragging and dropping. I selected the column just by selecting the name of it. And by the way, you can also click the little checkbox next to it. But I selected the column, the month column, and I dragged and dropped it into the axis section. And that allows you to add the month column into a certain part of the visual that you've selected. Okay? So grab the month column and drop it into the axis section. By the way, if you had just clicked on the little checkbox, that would do the same thing, at least in this scenario. All right. The other thing I'd like to do is I want to bring in the, essentially I want to see a count of the banks. And I want to know how many banks have failed by month. And so I'm going to grab the bank name column because I don't really have a metric right now. But what I'd like to do is I want to do a count of all of the bank names that I find within my data set. So a count meaning count the banks that we have. And so to do that, I'm going to grab the bank name column and I'm going to drag and drop this one into the values section. Now the value section of your visuals, and you'll see most of your visuals will have a value section. This is where you're going to drag and drop in your metrics. Your metrics are almost always going to go into the value section. So whatever it is you're trying to analyze, this is why my report visual is blank right now. It's blank because I haven't brought in any measure for it to actually be able to analyze. So if we drag and drop the bank name into the value section right here, that will produce a report visual that shows me my number of failed banks by month. Now we're running into a little bit of an issue here though, and I'm sure many of you can probably figure out what is going. You can feel free to put it in the chat if you want, but this is the issue that I mentioned that I purposely am running into. If you notice right now, every one of my months, so notice April has 563 failed banks, and August has the same number, and December has the same number, and February has the same number. Every one of my months has the exact same number of failed banks. So there's something going on here. And I'm sure many of you that have worked with Power BI for some time realize that the issue is that I don't have any relationship to right now between these two tables. So I have a calendar table and I have a failed banks table, but I've yet to tell Power BI how these two tables are able to communicate with each other. And that's why you're seeing this duplicated value across every single month. Because when you bring two tables in and fields from two tables that don't have relationship, this is how Power BI is going to react. And that's why I wanted to show this to you, is so that you realize when you see something like this on your screen, when you're working on your own solutions, that your issue has likely to do with the relationships. The other issue that I'm sure many of you are noticing is that the sort order of this column chart is not right either. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to that problem. That'll be problem number 2 that we need to solve. That's also a data modeling problem. But let's fix problem number 1 first. Problem number 1, again, is that we have no relationship between these two tables. We have a calendar table, we have a failed banks table, but we've yet to tell Power BI how these two tables communicate with each other. Where we need to go to solve this problem, it's a data modeling problem, okay? And the place we need to go to solve this data modeling problem is that model view, sorry, my zoom acted up there a little bit, is the model view on the left-hand side. So you're going to select the little icon for the model view on the left-hand side, and that's going to take us to where we can define our relationship between these two tables. So go ahead and work your way over to that model view. And when you work your way over to the model view, you should see something that looks like this. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit so you can see this a lot better. You have two tables that are disconnected from each other. There's no relationship between either of the tables, so you have no way for these two tables to communicate with each other. Okay? So we need to define, how does table 1 communicate with table 2? Okay? How does table A communicate with table B? How does my calendar table communicate with our failed banks table? I need to define the relationship between these two tables. And the way that you can define that relationship is by simply dragging and dropping a relationship between the two tables. So from your perspective, you have to think, you have to step back for a moment and look at the kind of data that you have in each table. Obviously, my calendar table has date information in it. So if I'm trying to figure out how does that relate to my failed banks table, then I need to try and find which column inside my date table, hint, hint, it's going to be closing date here. I need to find which column from my failed banks table is going to be the basis of a relationship between the two tables we have here. All right, so if I want to define a relationship here, you can do that by dragging and dropping the date column from your calendar table and drag and drop it on top of the closing date inside of your failed banks table. And one question we oftentimes get is, does it matter what order you drag it in? Can you drag closing date on top of date, or can you drag date on top of closing date? It actually does not matter what order you do it in. If you, Power BI is smart enough to figure out which direction the relationship should go based on the data that you have within inside of your calendar here. So I'm going to drag and drop failed banks closing date on top of the date column inside of our calendar table. Matt from our team, who's monitoring the chat, says that we had a question about the auto date time making the hierarchy for us, and why we would want to use our own date table. If you need a filler for time, you can. Okay, sorry, I'm reading. He's telling me if I need to fill time. So there was a question about the question here that came in is, why not just use the date information that's provided to you? So here's the question. Whenever we look at our failed banks table, and let's look at this, you guys hang tight here for a moment. I'm going to come right back here, but I need to show this from the report view. So when you look at our failed banks table, and actually it's gone now. As soon as I went to create that relationship, it left. But many of you, before we created that relationship, likely saw that the closing date column already had a hierarchy that's part of it that you could leverage and use. And so the question is, well, why do I need to create this separate date table? What benefit am I getting by creating this separate date table that we're looking at here? There's a lot of benefits, actually. Some of the benefits that you'll get from creating this separate date table I've already mentioned. So just as a reminder of some of those I mentioned earlier, if you need to do things like analyzing fiscal dates, you got to have a fiscal calendar stored somewhere, and you'll traditionally do that with inside of a date table. And a lot of you, especially if you're looking at financial data, need to analyze data over a fiscal calendar. So that's one of the big reasons why people create separate calendar or date tables. You also have the ability now to analyze and look at things like how busy were we on a weekend versus a weekday? How busy were we on holidays? Things like that. By having just the regular closing date column by itself, you do have the ability to kind of drill in from a year and go down to a quarter and go down to a day level. You have a date hierarchy that's provided to you, but it is lacking some other features that you get with inside Power BI by creating the date table. So it is helpful to have this date table, okay? Because of the reasons I just listed, there's a lot of others. When it comes to time intelligence that you can do with inside DAX, there's some benefits as well. But just keep that in mind. There is a big benefit to having this date table as opposed to just only using the dates that are provided to you with inside of your in this case, failed banks table. All right, now we've created this relationship between our two tables. So the relationship has now been created. We can leverage and use this relationship. In fact, you might have noticed when I flip back over to the report view for a moment, and you can go ahead and go back over there with me. When I flipped back over to the report view, and go ahead and do that with me now, click on the report view. When I go back over to the report view, you may have noticed that our report visual was automatically fixed, or at least partially fixed. The part that was fixed was it now isn't bringing back the duplicate values over and over. You're now seeing a correct value returned back for each month. So as I look at July, I can see 74 values above me, and October has 63 values. It's not showing that 563 failed banks for every single month anymore. So there's a lot of added benefit here now that we've created the relationship. We're not just benefit, it's more accurate data. We're actually seeing accurate results returned back. So now that relationship has, as soon as we define the relationship and we come back to our report view, you'll immediately see the results shown here, and you'll immediately see the correct numbers being returned back. Now, let's address the second problem. The first problem was we were lacking a relationship. The second problem that needs to be addressed here is the sort order of our months. Right now, our months are coming in here, and it's actually changed the sort order since last we saw it. If you remember last time we saw this, it was sorting it alphabetically. Now it's sorting it by the number of failed banks. So whichever number of failed banks is highest is on the left to the lowest number of failed banks on the right. You can change the sort order on individual visuals by going up to the top right-hand corner of the visual. So if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see this little more options, 3 dots right here. If you click on the more options, you'll then see above me there's an option where you can change how the data is being sorted. So right now it's sorting by the count of bank name, meaning the more banks you have, that's how it's going to sort. So that's why you're seeing July 1st, is because that's where the most number of failed banks are. Instead, however, we're going to sort by the month. So we're going to change the sort order to sort by the month, which will change things a little bit. But now you'll notice that it's still not sorting properly. The reason why it's not sorting properly still is, one, it's still sorting descending. So it's sorting in a descending order. We're going to switch that to ascending here. So go ahead and switch. Again, click on more options one more time here and say that you want to sort ascending instead of descending. I like how it makes the screen I'm looking at makes it look like I'm actually looking at the thing up there. But you can see now it's sorted ascending, but it's sorting alphabetically, right? That's not right. We should not be sorting alphabetical months. There's never a case where I want to see April before January as far as the sort order of our months. So that's the next thing that I need to fix, is I need to fix that, yes, we are sorting the months, but rather than sorting it alphabetically, we want to sort it chronologically, or the typical way that we're used to sorting months by. Okay, so this next step is another data modeling fix. This is an issue with my data model that needs to be fixed, and once I fix it once, it will carry over to every visual that uses the months in the future. Okay, so to fix the sort order here, I'm going to choose and select my month column from my calendar table. So we're going to go find my calendar table from our fields list above me, and we're going to choose the month column. So I'm going to go choose the month column right here. When you choose it, however, make sure you choose the text of the column. Don't click on the check mark. Leave the check mark there. Click on the text for month to be able to select it. And you'll notice whenever I have it selected, it's got this gray rectangle around it that tells you that you have it selected. And that means that I can now modify this column's settings. Okay, so you're going to go over to the field list, expand calendar, and then select the name of the column. That'd be month here. With the month column selected, again, don't worry about the check mark. That's not what we're trying to do. You're trying to highlight the month column. And with it highlighted, you're going to then go up to the column tools, column tools ribbon. We're in the right place. And underneath column tools, and by the way, if for some reason you don't see column tools, that means you don't have a column selected. So if for some reason column tools is not visible to you, go back over to your fields list and just double check that you have month selected. All right, we do have it selected, so let's go back over here to column tools. And within inside column tools, we're going to change this property right here that says sort by column. And we're going to tell Power BI that we want to display the month name, but we want to sort by the month number. So if we expand or hit the down arrow on sort by column, we can tell that Power BI that we want to sort our month column by the month number instead. So by sorting by month number, check out, I'm going to go ahead and select this. I'll tell you what, I'll leave this on the screen here for a few moments. But select month, sort by column, and choose month number. This is why we brought in that month number column to begin with. But if we select this, it's going to update our data model, and then look what happens. Immediately, or depending on how fast your machine is, it may take a few seconds, but immediately we can see that now our months are sorting properly. We can see January to December instead of April, August, December. It's now sorting by the month number instead of the month name, which gets you the results that you would expect to see in a visual like this, as opposed to what it was doing by default. So again, one more time, how did I do that? I went up to and highlighted my month column. Okay, so click on the text. And then with it selected, with that gray rectangle around it, we went up to column tools, and we selected sort by column, and we told it we want to sort the month name by the month number, so that way it would properly return back the order of the months and the way you would expect to see. Okay? All right, so that's it for that setting. All right, cool. So now that we've gotten that taken care of, I want to expose you a little bit more into some other small data modeling features that are helpful. There are some that we're just not going to have time for today. I recommend taking a look at our more in-depth classes to learn a lot more about different data modeling features that you can add. The feature that I am going to highlight here as we come back is how to create DAX measures. Okay? What we did so far was we created a DAX calculated column, but now we're going to show a calculated measure and how you can create those. There are a bunch of other data modeling features that we could implement here next. We can create hierarchies. We can create and hide columns if we wanted to. You can create groups within inside your data model. There's a bunch of other things that we could do. Obviously, time is limited in a 3-hour span here. So I would definitely recommend kind of exploring some of the other data modeling courses that we have at Pragmatic Works to get a little bit more in depth. But what I'd like to do before we take our second break of the afternoon, or of the session, you might not be in the afternoon where you're at, but what I want to do before we take our next break is to show you a little bit of DAX. And we showed some DAX earlier when it came to that calculated table that we created, but I want to show you now a way to create calculated measures within inside of your data model. Okay? So to create new measures, and again, this is worth spending a few seconds discussing, there are different types of DAX functions that you can create, and you can find them if you look underneath the modeling tab. Just watch this for a moment. You'll find when you look underneath modeling that there are several different types of calculations that you can create. All right, so the different types of calculations you can create are new tables. We already did that. We created a calendar table. When we created the calendar table, we did a new table. We also have already done new column. That was when we added new columns to that table. So every time we clicked on new column, it allowed us to add another categorical column. So think about within inside of our calendar table, we created a month column, we created a year column, we created a month number column. That was all done by creating new columns using this option right here. These are all done using DAX, by the way. So the data analysis expression language, which again, check out our 3-hour recorded one we've already done on Learn with the Nerds focused on DAX. But you can learn a lot more about the DAX language there. So we've already created a new table. We've already created a new column. Now we're going to spend some time talking about measures. That's really both of these. Now, the new measure option that you see here, this option allows you to create and write a DAX measure from scratch. So let's spend 30 seconds here talking about measures versus columns. Okay? Measures, you should think of as more your metric values, okay? So measures are going to be those aggregates that you have. So measures are going to be things that you do like sums and mins and maxes and counts and count distincts. These are going to be all of those typical aggregates that you work with. Now, it doesn't mean that calculated columns can't be aggregates as well. I'm kind of generalizing a little bit here and saying that, hey, measures are always going to be your more numeric metrics that you're trying to analyze. There are some use cases where they could fall into the columns camp, but generally speaking, calculated measures, this guy right here, are going to be your metrics. Now, calculated columns, let's draw a little line here. Calculated columns, on the other hand, are going to be more of your category or categorical data. This could also be more of your descriptive data or categorical data, where it's more data that's describing your metrics. So in our scenario, we created calculated columns to return back the month name, the year. Those are not metric columns. Those are obviously more descriptive columns. They describe our metrics that we're going to have. So that's kind of the understanding, or what you should understand, at least at a high level. There is, I'm generalizing here some. You could break the rules of any generalization, of course, at any time. But generally speaking, calculated columns, which are these, are going to be more descriptive columns or categorical columns, whereas measures are going to be more metrics. So that's generally speaking the difference between the two. Now you might be wondering, okay, well that's great. What's quick measures? So I have another thing here called quick measures. What's quick measures? What quick measures is a catalog of pre-built DAX formulas where you can plug in your columns and Power BI will automatically produce measures for you. So it's kind of cool. It's worth taking a peek at. I actually have a contribution in there as well. You'll actually find my name in that section. I contribute, not to brag or anything, but you'll be able to find a lot of pre-built calculations in there where you can, as you're learning DAX, you can leverage those as starting points for building out your measures or your metrics, okay? But generally, it's kind of good to have this overview of what's the difference between the two. This is the difference. Categorical data, descriptive data versus more metric and aggregate data. All right, so we're going to create a new measure, which means we're talking about a metric in some way. And there are multiple places you can go to create the metric. I can go up to the modeling tab I'm in right now, and I can create the measure here. Or if I go back over to my fields list on the right-hand side, I actually like to create the measures from here. This is just a personal preference. The reason I like to create them here is it ensures that the measure gets added to the correct table, because there are some cases where your measure could get added to a different table that you didn't intend it to, and so that's why I like to come to the fields list to add a new measure here. So to add a new measure, I'm going to right-click on my failed banks table. So I'm going to right-click on failed banks, and I'm going to take myself off camera for a moment. And underneath the failed banks table, when you right-click on it, so again, I right-clicked, and then I'm going to select New Measure. Okay, so you're going to choose the New Measure option here. And when you choose New Measure, it's going to add to a new empty formula bar. So I'm going to go over to the formula bar over here. You'll see that we now have a new empty measure here that we can start to write our DAX formula in. So I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit. Here we go, so you can see that a lot clearer. And what I want to do in this, really one measure we're going to do. We're not going to do a ton of measures, but in this one measure that we're going to create a count of all of our failed banks. Now we could continue to leverage, if you remember earlier, we dragged and dropped in the bank name into our visual, and it automatically did a count on it. That's what's known as an implicit measure. However, it's a better practice, I'm not going to say best, it's a better practice, to do an explicit measure where you actively create a calculation here that defines how that data is going to be aggregated. This is kind of the better practice here. And so what we're going to do, instead of just dragging bank name into every one of our visuals, is we're going to create this new measure, and we're going to name it to the left of the equal sign. We're going to call this total banks. Oops, let's try and rename the whole thing. Let's call this total banks. Okay, and then to the right of the equal sign, we're just going to do a count. And there's a bunch of different counts that are available to you. So as I start to type count, you'll see there are a bunch of different counts that are an option here for me. I can do count, count A, count X, count blank, count rows, all count distinct, or distinct count, it's actually listed as here. And in this case, I'm going to do a count rows. Count rows is going to count all of the rows I have in my table, which will produce the result I need, because every row within inside of this failed banks table is an individual failed bank. So I'm going to do count rows here, and then I'm going to tell it which one of the tables, I only have two, which one of the tables do I want to count the rows on? And I'm going to tell it that I want to count the rows on my failed banks table. And so again, leverage the IntelliSense. As you start to type, you can then use the IntelliSense to bring back the failed banks table here. All right, I'll close a parenthesis here and then hit enter, and that will create our first calculated measure that's going to return back a failed banks count. And I can find that count over in my list above my head here. You'll see that there's a new little calculation here. You can tell it's a new one because it's got the little calculator icon next to it above me. And that new total banks measure is now what I'll use as my metric that I bring into each one of my visuals. And the great thing about creating these measures, as opposed to just kind of dragging in bank name each time, is now I can build them on top of each other. I can take this total banks measure that we created, and I can use it in all sorts of other measures that we create. So if I want to nest this measure in other measures, you can do that. You can refer to one measure and another measure. And so I can build them on top of each other and kind of have this building blocks of all these different measures that we want to create. Okay? All right, so I think we are due for another break. So let's take one more 5-minute break for our session. I know those are short, but go ahead and get yourself a drink. When we come back from this next 5-minute break, we are going to go on to the last portion of the class, which is going to be focused on data visualizations. And we'll also spend a few moments talking about what do I do with this once I've created my reports? How do I share it with others? We're going to spend a few moments on that as well. All right, so I'll see everyone in 5 minutes, and then when we come back, we will continue forward and wrap up our session. See you in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back for the last section of our class today. Hopefully you've been enjoying it so far. Let us know in the comments if you're enjoying the class. I will see them later. Matt is doing a good job monitoring the chat, but don't worry, I will take a look at hopefully some good love later. But I appreciate you guys joining us. Obviously, like I mentioned a couple times now, the 3-hour class, there's only so much we can go into. Certainly do check out, as a reminder, hopefully you don't feel like I'm pitching you too hard here, but as a reminder, make sure you check out our sale that we have going on our on-demand learning. That's 75% off. You can find on our website. Go to our website, enter in the code EVENT75. And I'm not sharing it. Let me share that on my screen here. That would be helpful. But using that code EVENT75 would allow you to get 75% off on our on-demand learning. That's an annual subscription, so it does allow you to be able to watch our courses over the course of a year. And a lot of more in-depth Power BI courses, 18 different Power BI courses. A lot of good stuff out there. And again, we just highlighted DAX and data modeling. We have 2 DAX courses, 2 different data modeling courses, so we can definitely get you more in depth when it comes to some of the topics that we covered during the last hour. So thank you for hanging in there with me. Let's start our last section of the day, which is going to be focused in on data visualizations. And so I'm going to go ahead and bring up on my screen, and we'll flip over to the proper screen here. So this next section is going to focus in on visualization creation. We're also then going to start to talk about how do I publish and share this with others. That section will be pretty brief, so I'll let you know that in advance. We do have some other classes that go much more in depth into that. Definitely take a look at that. But we're going to focus in this section on data visualizations, building out visuals, and then we'll talk about how to publish and share this with others. Okay? Now, during that publish section, you may consider just watching during that publish section if you don't already have a Power BI subscription. Consider that when we get to that later on. Now, you should still be able to follow on through the majority of this next section, because what we're going to be doing in this next section is to start to build some visuals on top of this data model. Now, we've already done one visual. You can see that on our screen now. But I'd like to continue to build out some additional visuals, including maybe re-show you how I did that one earlier this morning or earlier in our session, where I was able to return back the total number of failed banks in a bar chart. So as a reminder, as you are starting to work with and build out your visuals, you should note that whenever you want to create a new visual, you want to make sure you have selected somewhere in the background of your report. At the moment, I currently have this column chart selected. Again, you can tell I have it selected because the little anchor points that appear around my visual. And because those anchor points are around there, Power BI thinks that I'm trying to edit this visual. So if you want to make sure you create a new visual, click somewhere in the background of your report, like so. And then with nothing selected, you can select the new visual you want and start to add the new fields to it you want. So if I wanted to be able to display a bar chart that shows me my total number of failed banks by state, then I can do that now. I can come over to my visualizations pane right here. And underneath the visualizations pane, I can select something like the stacked bar chart and then choose which fields do I want to add to that bar chart. So I'm going to go ahead and select stacked bar chart here. I'm going to remove my face from the screen for a few moments. And I'll add the stacked bar chart to the screen. And with the stacked bar chart selected, by the way, I know you don't see it on the left-hand side of my screen, but I do have it selected right now. It's right here. But with it selected, we're going to add in some fields into it. So I'm going to add into that stacked bar chart, I want to see my total banks. So we're going to add in that new measure that we just created earlier called total banks, and you can just check it off. You can see it adds it into the value section. Remember we talked about the value section earlier and how the value section is where your metrics will land whenever you build out your visuals. So whenever I just checked off total banks, it knew that I was referring to a measure and that it should go in the values section. But then on the axis and the legends areas, we can define how else do we want to slice the data. So if I want to, for example, see the number of failed banks by state, then I could do something like select the state column here, and you'll see that it'll add it into the axis where I can now view my total number of failed banks by state. And so if we look on the left-hand side here now, I can shift this around, resize it however I want, and I can see my total number of failed banks by state. Now, one additional thing that we could also do is I could slice this a couple different ways. So if I wanted to, I could add in, let's say, for example, the year column. This time, don't check it. What I want you to do instead this time is we're going to drag and drop the year column into the legend section right here. So if I drag and drop year into the legend, like so, take a look at what we got now. So now it's actually allowing us to slice not only by the state, but also by the years where each of the failed banks have occurred. Now, one of the things that's really powerful about Power BI is that you do have the ability to have things like cross-highlighting and cross-filtering that automatically work with inside Power BI. So as I go to select and interact with these visuals, so say for example I click on Georgia, notice that whenever I click on a particular data point within inside of my visuals, that you have things like cross-highlighting and cross-filtering that are automatically enabled that allow you to see the slice of the data that in this case is relative to Georgia. So I can go look at exactly how many failed banks I had in Georgia in each one of these months because I highlighted or selected the state here. The way I did that, by the way, is I actually clicked on the abbreviation and the axes on the side here, and I can click on Florida or Illinois, or I can multi-select and hold down Control and select multiple states if I wanted to. You can also hold down your, you can also, if you wanted to, select individual slices within inside of the year. So if I want to look at not just Georgia, but the year Georgia 2009, I can select that specific year to see the sales for, or not sales, but the failed banks for Georgia in the year 2009. Now, one of the things that's happening right now is the interaction between these two visuals is it's automatically doing this highlight. You'll notice that it's highlighting a portion of the chart. The rest of the chart here is in this darker blue. That's where we have this cross-section of values. But then the rest of it is kind of this grayed out, transparent almost view of the data. Now, you have control over how that appears on your reports. You actually can determine whether or not it highlights those results or it just outright filters those results. And so if you want to have some ability to customize that, there is a feature that's found underneath the Format tab right here. And if you want to follow along with this part, you can. This part's kind of optional. But if I go underneath the Format tab, I can select. And by the way, the Format tab may not appear to you unless you select a visual. So if you don't have a visual selected, you won't see it. Click on a visual, then you'll see the Format tab. So if for some reason you're not seeing it, that's why. But with my bar chart selected, I'm going to choose the Format tab. And you'll find there's this option on the top left called Edit Interactions right here. And that Edit Interactions feature allows you to determine how each of your visuals are going to interact with each other. So if I select Edit Interactions here, what that does is it turns on a few settings that you can now switch to manipulate how these visuals will interact with each other. So let me show you what I mean by that. Right now you can tell I have the the bar chart selected. You can see the bar chart has the little anchor points around it that indicates that it is selected. And the way that the Edit Interaction feature works is whichever visual you have selected, you're actually configuring the other visuals. So let me show you what I mean by that. We have the bar chart selected, but these little icons right here appear on my other visuals. I only have one other one in this scenario. And what this does is it determines what will happen when I click on things in my bar chart that's way over here. So I know it's a little confusing, but it's whatever visual you have selected, you're actually going to choose and click on things on the other visuals on your screen to determine how they're going to interact with each other. Okay? So with the bar chart selected, I'm then going to choose, and let's actually do this. I'm going to click on Georgia again so you can really tell the difference. Right now it's highlighting my values, but you have these other options right here where you can filter your values. So if I were to select filter, notice what happens. So check out what happens now. Now when I go to click on my states, it's not highlighting anymore. Now it's doing a filter instead. If I were to flip that back to highlight, it goes back to that view that we had before. So the point is you have flexibility to choose how that interaction occurs. You get to determine, do you want it to filter the data like that, or do you want it to highlight the data like this? You also have the option to choose if you want two visuals not to do any interaction between each other. There's another option here called None, and if I were to select the None option, that would mean that whenever I go to select something in my bar chart, it's going to do nothing to my column chart. So you have the ability to choose what kind of interaction you want. I frankly kind of like the highlight. I think the highlight, which was the default, is kind of a neat way to view the data, but it really depends on your business scenario, which option you choose, which is most appropriate for you. So that's Edit Interactions. That's a feature I wanted to highlight to make sure you know you have control over how each of your visuals interact with each other. Now the other thing to point out here is as you go to edit your visuals, you can adjust the way the aesthetics of these visuals look. you have the ability to change the font size, the colors, all of the aesthetics that go along with your visuals can be manipulated and modified by, again, making sure you have a visual selected. So I have my bar chart selected. And then you can go over to this format section that's above me. Let me take myself off screen here again. You can select this little format section right here. See where the paintbrush is, the little paint roller. That paint roller icon where it says format allows you to modify any one of the visuals that you have selected. So if I were to select the column chart, I would see settings for the column chart. But within inside of here, you can see there are all sorts of settings that you can turn on and tweak. If you want to do something like turn on data labels, you can turn on data labels here. If I wanted to do something like add a background color to my visual, I can do that. If I wanted to add a border to my visual, I can do that. If I want to change the title, I can come in here and change the title of my visual. So the point being is there's all sorts of different settings in here that you can manipulate. Because there are so many settings, they have made it easier for you to find those settings by using this search capability right here. So if I wanted to search for a particular setting, say for example the font size, I could search for something like size, and this will show me all of the settings that have the word size that are part of them. So if I want to bump up the text size on my visual, on my legend, I can bump that up some. If I want to bump up the text size on my y-axis, I can do that. Or I can go down to my x-axis and I can do that here as well. So the idea here, though, is that you have the ability to adjust the settings on your visuals by going underneath the Format Paintbrush icon right here. Again, you only are going to be able to do that once you have the visual selected, and then you can use this nice little search capability to find the settings that you really care about. All right, so let me unzoom so you can see what happened when I made those changes. You can see that by making those changes, I've increased the font size, but I've also added in data labels now so I can see exactly what the values are without me having to hover above each one to see them. So that is called, that's really the format section where you can add in data labels and things like that. So some nice setting capabilities in there. I could have adjusted the colors if I wanted to as well. Speaking of colors and speaking of aesthetics of your reports, you also can create and design themes. So think of a theme like if you're working within PowerPoint, you've likely leveraged a PowerPoint theme before. Or in Excel, you have themes that you can set up on your tables where they follow a certain color pattern. You can do the same thing with inside of Power BI. Power BI has themes that you can either use or you can create your own themes if you wanted to. To design a theme, you would do that from the View menu. That would be far up top here under the View menu. So you go ahead and feel free to follow along on this. Under the View menu, there is a section devoted to themes. And again, the idea of a theme is you're basically trying to standardize the look and feel of your report. So all sorts of aesthetic changes that you can make on your reports can be found underneath the View section, and then more specifically underneath the Themes section right here. So you're going to go to View and then Themes, and you can expand the Themes section here to see the different themes that are available to you. So Power BI has several pre-built themes that you'll find here that you can choose from. There are several that you might find useful, including ones like a colorblind safe theme that I'm highlighting right now, or I'm hovering above right now. But you can choose any of the ones that you want in here. And as you select them, you'll notice that it completely changes your report whenever you select them. This one's pretty 1995 looking, but that's okay. This little swooshy thing, I'm pretty sure this used to be a screensaver on my computer back in the 90s. But you can choose from some of these themes that are already available, or say you want to create your own theme. So let's walk you through how you can create your own theme here. If I expand the theme section here again, I'm going to switch this back to the default view that we had a moment ago. So I'm going to flip this back to the default theme. Okay, you can see it's back to normal here now. So I chose this one just to go back to normal. But now that I've gotten back to the normal theme, I'm going to create my own theme and show how you can make some modifications to the theme as you start to use it. Now to create your own theme, you'll do that by going down to the Customize Current Theme button that you'll see towards the bottom of my screen here on the right, or on the left I should say. And then I'll select Customize Current Theme File, or Customize Current Theme. So when I select this, it's going to pop open on my screen the Customize Theme window. Let me take myself off screen for a moment. Underneath the Customize Current Theme window, here I can name the theme, I can change the colors that are being used in the theme, I can add borders to every one of my visuals, backgrounds to every one of my visuals. You can essentially standardize the way that your reports look, and then you can save this theme file and then share it with others so that everyone within your organization continues to follow the same standards that you set when it comes to the report look and feel. So I'm going to go ahead and name this theme. We'll call this our Learn with the Nerds. Learn with the Nerds. Come on. There we go. And then I can start to adjust some of the colors. And I'm going to probably choose some pretty terrible colors. I always tend to do that when I'm doing this very ad hoc. This is kind of like a mint green color here. We'll select that. We'll choose some other ones in here that are probably not going to be very good either. There we go. I'm just doing them kind of quickly here just to show you that you can customize these. There we go. All right, so I've adjusted and changed some of the colors that are part of my theme. You can also change things like the text. If you want to change the font size that's being used for every one of your visuals, you can come in and bump up the font size some. You can come change the font type that's being used. So if you want to be really saucy here, you can make everything Comic Sans. I won't do that to you, but you could do that. I'll come in and do Arial Black for this one. You can change the font colors that are being used as well. Actually, a section I really like to adjust is the visualization section because I like to add a little background color to my visuals. So I'm going to add into the background color maybe this little salmon color here. I'm going really saucy here with the colors. I'm going to go with a salmon color here to my background color for every one of my visuals. And then I'm going to also add in a border. So I can go under the border section here. And if I'm doing, by the way, if I'm doing this a little fast, don't forget you can rewind me and go take a look at what I did again, but you don't have to get the exact same colors as me. I'm just kind of picking them at random. But I'm going to add a border to every one of my visuals as well. So I'm going to go under the border section, turn on the border, and I can tell it what color border I want. I can also tell it that I want it to be a rounded edge border. That's what radius does. So if I want to have a rounded edge to my border, I can actually change the radius property here to something like 20. And then that way, whenever I go to look at this report and I click OK or Apply on this new theme that we've created, check out what happens. And again, I just picked a bunch of things at random, so don't get too hung up on the specific settings that I changed in my theme, but I just made some changes. And then now when I hit Apply, look at what it does. It modifies my report to pick up all of the theme colors that I use, the font colors I used, and the font type that I used, as well as things like the rounded edge borders. So you can see all of my borders have rounded edges to them. And I added a nice little background color. I don't know if it's nice, I shouldn't say nice, but I added a background color to every one of my visuals here. So the idea here with themes is that you can standardize the look and feel that you want for your report. You can then save that theme. So let me show you how you can save the theme file. I would come back up over to my View and Themes section here. And then I would tell it down on the bottom that I want to save the current theme over here. So if I select that I want to save the current theme, it's going to save it as what's known as a JSON file, which is basically storing all of the metadata for the report changes that we've made. So I can save all those settings that I've made by hitting Save Current Theme, and you can see here that it saves it as a JSON file, and then I can name this whatever I want, and then share this file with any of my colleagues. So if I go to share this with Matt or Julia or anyone else that I work with at Pragmatic Works, and then I give them the JSON file or the theme file, it doesn't really matter what the type of file is for the purposes of what we're doing, but it's going to save the settings for this file, for this the visuals into a file, and then I can my colleagues can then take this JSON file that we just saved, and I'll go ahead and hit save here. Oh, I already have one. Oh, let's switch this to a folder I have permissions to. Looks like it's trying to save it into an odd folder here. We'll just save it here. But then I can take that theme file and I'll share it with my colleagues, and they can then import it into their solutions, and then their solutions will pick up all the settings that I've set here. So that's one of the big benefits of using theme files, is you can kind of recycle these settings that you've defined so that your colleagues don't have to go through and do the same set of steps again. They can just kind of follow the standards that you've already set. So if they're going to consume the theme file that we just created, they can do that by going back up to View and back underneath Themes, and then we're going to go down to where it says Browse for Themes. So when you see Browse for Themes, that's where you'll actually select the theme file that someone else has created. and then you can leverage and use that as part of your solution. So I would have to go navigate to the file folder where I have that right here to be able to leverage and use that theme file. And again, I would need to mail this around or email this around to everyone or Teams it to everyone that I want to have use the same theme file as me, but then they can consume that and use that as part of their solution. Okay, so that's theme files. It's a great way to kind of standardize the look and feel of your reports as you start to begin to create more and more interesting reports. Now, the next thing I want to show you is something that's a little bit more advanced. This leans on that more of a pro feature than a beginner feature, but I want to get you some exposure into some of these more advanced features, even for those of you that are new to Power BI. And the reason why I think it's helpful to get into some of these more advanced features is because there's a lot of stuff with Power BI that I am just not going to have time to show you in this short time frame. So I want to expose you into some more of these little bit more advanced features so you know that it's possible to do these things. So that way, whenever you are expanding on your knowledge base with inside Power BI, you can remember, well, didn't Devin tell me that I could do something like this? And so that's why I want to show you in this next section a really cool feature. This is one of my favorite features. I'm going to try and sneak in 2 quick report features here. We'll see how we are on time here as we're getting to the last half hour of our session. But I want to try and sneak in 2 features, but at the very least, we're definitely going to get in one of them. And the first feature I want to show you is called Report Page Tooltips. Now, if you're not really familiar with what tooltips are, let me first highlight what a tooltip is for you. A tooltip is every time you go to hover above one of your data points. Anytime I go to hover above a data point, that's a tooltip. So that little gray box that you see popping up, that whenever I go to move around, it changes its values based on whatever I'm hovering above, that is a tooltip. You'll see the tooltip over here as well. Whenever I go to hover above my column chart, you'll see a tooltip there as well. And so what I'd like to do is I want to customize this tooltip. The tooltip that's here by default is fine, but I want to customize it and make it my own. This is one of my favorite Power BI features. It's why I always like to sneak it in there just to make sure you know, hey, that you can do something a lot cooler than the default setting that we see here today. So what we're going to do is we're going to customize that pop-up. It's known as a tooltip. And we're going to replace that default tooltip with one of our own making. Okay, with one of our own design. Now, the way that you do this is you need to create a second report page. And everything that we've done so far has been inclusive with inside of this one report page. But you should note, if you look at the bottom of your screen, that you can have more than one page to this report. So right now we've been developing one report. But if we want to create additional pages to this report, we would click the little plus sign down here, kind of similar to like what you have in Excel whenever you create additional Excel spreadsheets. So what I want to do is I'm going to add in another report page down to the bottom. And it probably makes sense to name these. Right now I haven't really named them something very appropriate. So I'm going to rename the first page. You can rename them by right-clicking and selecting Rename, or you can double-click on them and you can rename them that way as well. I'm going to go ahead and call this my Report Summary. And then on page number 2, I'm going to go ahead and rename that one. We'll call this our Report Page Tooltip. Okay, so I've given these 2 different report pages names here. And the other thing that I'm going to do that's kind of unique is I'm going to hide this second page. You can hide report pages by right-clicking on a report page and selecting Hide Page. And I'm going to explain a little bit more later on why we're going to do this, but I'm going to do it now, and then you'll see the reason why we're doing it as we move along through this example. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on Report Page Tooltip. That's the name of my page here. And I'm going to select Hide Page. And you can see when I do that, it adds a little eye with a line through it indicator telling you there that it's been hidden. All right. So I'll explain more about why we're hiding it as we move along through this example. Now, inside this new report page, and make sure you have, if you're following along, select the Report Page Tooltip page. That's the new page that we just created. And we're going to make a few settings changes on this page. Before we even bring any visual onto our design surface, we're going to make a few settings changes to the design surface of this report. So to do that, we're going to work our way over to the settings. That's the little paintbrush icon that we've looked at, the format settings that we've looked at a few times now. But we're going to go click on the format settings of this report page. So I'm going to go ahead and select that here. And then you'll notice that there's a few settings that you can turn on or tweak specific to the overall page of the report you're looking at. So you have things like page information, page size, page background, page alignment, all sorts of things that you can set here. And the first setting that I want you to modify here with me is the one called page information. So we're going to go ahead and expand that. And we're going to flip this switch that's called tooltip. Now I'm going to show you several settings here, and this might be an area where you need to rewind me as we go a little bit further on, because we're going to flip probably 4 or 5 different settings here to make this work. And so you might need to rewind me in the YouTube player to be able to catch up on some of the settings I'm going to do. But the first setting that we have to do, this is a mandatory one for this example, is we're going to flip on tooltip. The next couple settings that I'm going to show you are going to be optional. But what this feature did when we flip this on is it made it so that the page that we're looking at right now, this one that you see on the screen right now, can be turned into a tooltip to replace the default tooltips. So the first thing that we had to do was underneath page information is we had to flip this on to be available as a tooltip. Okay? If this was turned off, then we could never use it as a tooltip. So we turned that on as a tooltip. And then the next setting that we're going to do, the next one that I'm going to have you do is more of an optional thing, but I definitely recommend you do it, is I recommend you change the page size. And here's why. You guys stay here. Let me kind of show you the reason why we want to change the page size. But you guys stay right here. The reason why we want to change the page size is because if I don't change the page size, whenever we have the new tooltip that we're creating pop up, it's going to be the same size as the report that we're looking at. So that little gray box that you see right now that's popped up, it's going to be huge if we don't change the size of our report page. So that's why we're going to change the size, because we want it to be a more appropriate pop-up size. Otherwise, it's going to be something that's huge, that's 16 by 9. What we see right now on our screen is way too big to be a pop-up. So do this with me. We're going to modify the page size, and we're going to change this from 16 by 9 to instead use the tooltip size that's kind of built in here. You could customize the size, by the way. If you select custom, you could make your own size here if you want for the page size, but instead I'm going to make this a tooltip size. Okay? And then the final little setting that we're going to do here is I'm going to change the page background. Instead of being a white background, because it doesn't really stand out if I have a pop-up that has a white background on top of another pop-up that's a white background, I'm going to instead change this to more of a gray color, and I'll just make this a light gray here on the left. Okay? Now you'll notice that the page color doesn't change at all. For some reason, Power BI has transparency set to 100%, and so I'm going to knock this down to 0% so we can actually see that gray color that comes through. All right, so just a quick repeat. The 3 settings that we changed is the page information we turned on to tooltip is on. The page size we changed to the tooltip size. And then the page background, we made it a light gray, and we made the transparency 0% instead of 100%. All right, now with that done, we're going to start to build in a few report visuals. All right, so the report visuals that I want to bring in are going to be, one, a card visual. You can find the card visual available right here. That's the card visual. And we're going to go ahead and select the card visual to add it to our design surface. Okay, so go ahead and select that one I'm pointing at right here. All right, I'll put myself back on screen for a little bit. So we'll select the card visual here. And you're going to want to resize this because the card visual is going to take up way too much space here to begin with. So you'll want to bump this down in size quite a bit, and then kind of realign it so that it doesn't take up so much space. I'm going to move it to the left-hand side here a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in the total banks measure. That's the measure that we created earlier. I'm going to drag and drop, or you can go ahead and check the total banks measure to add it into that card visual that we just added. So again, the steps that we did here is we added a card visual right here. And then now we're going to add in the total banks measure into that new card visual that we just created. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now you can see here the font size is way too big. Part of that's because of the theme file that we created, the theme file I created. I made the fonts too big, so I could go through and align that. I could change the font size just for this one visual if I wanted to. For interest of time, just note that if I wanted to change the font size, I could. But I'm not going to do that because I want to kind of keep moving forward and keep making some progress here. The other thing that I want to do, though, is I'm going to add in another visual to the right of the card visual. And what I want to add to the right of the card visual is something that will show me, let's say, for example, a list, maybe even a map, that highlights all of the failed banks that we have. I want to be able to see whenever I go to hover above Florida or Georgia, I want to see a map pop up to show me where those failed banks are occurring. So to add a map, Power BI does have several maps that are available to you, but make sure you first click somewhere in the background of your report. So I'm going to click somewhere in the background of the report so it doesn't think I'm trying to edit the card visual. Now with the background of my report selected, I'm going to choose the standard map visual that you see right here. Okay, and that's going to be the visual we use on our screen. Do note that when you select this, it's going to be really, really large and you're going to have to resize it. Again, the reason why it's so large is because, remember, we changed our page size for this tooltip to be way smaller. That's why everything's appearing so large whenever we add it. So I'm going to add in the map visual. Oh, actually, it didn't make it too large. That was actually a nice, nice space that it took up here. But I will make it a little taller. Now, if it made it really large for you, just resize it, kind of grab the corners and resize it until it's a more appropriate size like we see here. But within inside of this new map, I'm going to bring in our total banks measure. So I'm going to go ahead and select total banks here and bring that into our size section down here. And you can just check it and it'll bring it into that size section. And then I also want to bring in our city-state column to be our location. So I'm going to drag and drop city-state into the location section of the report. Okay? Now you'll notice when I do this at first, nothing works. Nothing happens. There's no data points that are showing on my map. It looks like something's wrong. And what we've actually uncovered is a data modeling issue. Remember, I told you a lot of times when you're building your report visuals, you'll be able to expose and see data modeling issues as you build out your visuals. This is another data modeling issue that we've just uncovered. I do want to show you real quickly here the settings for this visual. So again, you'll see that we have total banks, and then we have location as our city-state. So make sure you have those two in there. But you'll, again, after you bring and match your visual to look like mine, you'll notice that my map is still showing as blank. The reason for that is there is a setting that we need to turn on our city-state column. So to fix this issue with me, select the city-state column from your field list. So I'm going to choose city-state, like so. Remember like how I showed you earlier where we modified the month sort? Remember we would change the month order, the sort order? This is kind of similar to that. You're going to select the city-state column and make sure you see that little gray box around it as you do it. So you can see this gray rectangle around it. Make sure you see it selected like this. And then once you have it selected, we're then going to go up to the top part of our screen to look for column tools again. We did this earlier. Last time when we did it, we were messing with the sort order. This time, we're messing with a different property called data category. Again, feel free to rewind me if I lose you a little bit. Just rewind me a tad, and hopefully that'll catch you up. All right, but the data category here, what I want to, you'll notice is right now it's set to uncategorized. And this data category is particularly helpful for you when you are dealing with geography data. And that's what we're doing when we go to bring data into a map. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to set the data category to be configured as a place for my city-state column. Now you might consider making this the city value here. You might consider making this state. But in actuality, it needs to be place. And the reason why you're going to use place is because if you remember what our field looks like, our field is actually a concatenation or a combination of merged columns of city and state together. And so that's why we're going to use the place setting here to be able to return back the value properly. So go ahead and select place here for our data category. And then when we do that, check out what happens. Now we can see all of our data points starting to appear on our map. Now our map is particularly small here. It's kind of hard to see what's going on with our map. We may even want to turn off the title, for example, to make it so we can see it a little better. But keep in mind, this is going to eventually be a pop-up as part of our, or a tooltip that's part of our report summary, okay? So you could turn off the title if you want. I'm going to do that real quickly. I'm going to make this is optional, guys. Don't worry about following me on this one. I'm going to select the map and go over to the format settings over here like we've been doing. Take myself off screen for a moment, and you'll see I could optionally turn off the title if I want. That way we just get a little bit more real estate. So if I flip title off, notice it gives me a little bit more real estate over here. That's totally optional. Don't get too hung up on that if you missed me on that one. That one's not worth rewinding. All right, so we've got the tooltip looking pretty good, but there's one more setting that we need to do to finalize this. And that one last setting that we need to change is going to be found underneath the fields list right here. So go back over to the fields list. Move you might already be looking at that, but I'm not looking at that right now because I turned off the title. So I'm going to go back over to my fields list. You may again already be looking at that, but I'm going to match you and look at that as well. And the final thing that we need to do has to do with this tooltip area down here on the bottom. This bottom area is where we're going to define how does my tooltip get launched. So how does my tooltip know to get launched? And what you're going to do is you're going to bring in a field from your field list somewhere up here. You're going to bring in a field that you want to pass into the tooltip. This is basically like a parameter. This allows you to pass in a value from one report to another report to be able to not only to display the tooltip, but also to filter the tooltip based on whatever value you are hovering above. Now there's a couple different fields that we could leverage here. We could bring in the state column if we want. We could bring in the state column here and say, hey, whatever state we're hovering above, go ahead and filter to that state only. You could also bring in your measure. You could bring in total banks. Either one of these would work. You can bring in either one of these fields and drag and drop them into the tooltip section to be able to see the tooltip in action. I'm going to bring in the state column for this example just to kind of show you what this looks like. And so I'm going to drag and drop the state column down into the tooltip area. Okay, I know there's a lot of settings for this one, guys, so hang in there with me on this one because this one has a big payoff at the end. But we're going to drag and drop the state column from your field list down into the tooltip area. Okay, so you're dragging and dropping state down into here. Once you've done that, you're done. And we're going to be able to see the big payoff here next. So let's take a look at the big payoff punch here, or the payoff pitch I'll go with. It's baseball season. Let's go with pitches. So let's take a look at what this did for us. Now that we've created this tooltip, we're going to go back over to our report summary. That's our first report page. So we're going to go ahead and select our first report page and take a look at what happens now. If we go to hover above our bar chart that we have in the top left, look at what's happening here. I'm going to zoom in on this for you. Notice now we replaced our standard old tooltip we had before with this new hotness. I'm going to go with that. This new hotness, this new kind of tooltip. This is the report page tooltip where we actually told Power BI to use a tooltip that we want instead of the one that you give us by default. So really powerful setting here. Again, you can hover over any one of the values. You can even go down to Missouri here if you want, and it'll show you exactly the values that you have for whatever area you hover above. So super powerful thing. This from a data visualization standpoint is really impactful. Allows your users to be able to interact with and see their data from a different perspective. So yeah, it's great that I can see this from a bar chart, but I'd like to see this a little bit more detailed. Well, now you can do something like a tooltip to get a little bit more of a granular view of your data. Super powerful stuff. Highly recommend learning more about this. I'm obviously showing you this in a very short time frame, but there's a lot more data storytelling type things that you can do. There's things like drill throughs you can do. There's report page tooltips that we just showed here. There are all sorts of different things that you can do to really make your reports pop. So I'd recommend, we have a data storytelling class with Power BI. That's part of our on-demand learning. I highly recommend you take a peep at that. That is a very popular course that really digs deeper into understanding how to build out reports that tell stories and aren't just a static view of data. It's great that you can create reports, but what can your users do with that data after they've viewed it? Are they able to ask more questions? Are they able to dig in deeper? What can they do with the data after you provided it to them? The last thing, I mentioned that there was two things I wanted to show you. This was one of them. The second thing that I want to show you, I have maybe 2 minutes to highlight here before we have to shift over to talking about sharing our solutions. So the last thing I'll kind of highlight here is a feature known as Q&A. Now Q&A stands for question and answer, as you might guess. And what Q&A allows you to do is to really kind of interact with your reports and your data model more specifically to ask questions about your data. So what Q&A is kind of an analogy for, it's kind of like having a search engine like a Google or a Bing. It's like being able to Google data against your data set. So to give you a little example of how this works, there is a Q&A visual. You can find the Q&A visual right here. Okay, that's one way you can launch Q&A. The other way you can launch Q&A is if you just double click in the background of your report. So if I find some white background area of my report and I double click here, this will automatically launch Q&A for me. And I'm going to show you a very brief 1-minute view of this because it is a really cool feature I think you'll like. And you can explore it a lot more from some of our other classes as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, it prompts me, it says ask a question about your data. And so I can type in here, I can say, hey, I want to know what were my total banks. Show me the total banks we had fail. So just like that, Q&A will produce a visual that shows me the total number of failed banks. It produces a card visual similar to what we did before. All right, that's interesting, but I want to see total banks, let's say between 2015 and 2020. Now, Q&A is pretty smart. Whenever you go to type in things like a between, Q&A realizes that you are trying to filter your data. And so you can type in and search and ask a question and get it to return back the correct results. Based on how you ask it, it will interpret a filter or a way of visualizing the data or a way of being able to present the data in different forms. So here I said between 2015 and 2020, it knew that that meant I wanted to filter the data. You can also tell it that, hey, I want to get a little bit more specific. And let's say I want to see total banks by city, state between 2015 and 2016. Let's actually remember my column is called city, state with an ST here. It's not spelled out. But I'm going to say total banks by city, state between 2015 and 2020. And right now you can see it's produced a map visual for me. So automatically, it produced a map visual. The reason why it produced this as a map visual, by the way, was because of that data category setting that we did earlier. Remember we did that data category setting where we told Power BI that the city-state column was a place? That's where that comes into play, why it automatically visualizes this as a map. Now you all can also control what visual it produces. So I can say, hey, this is great, but I want to see this as a, let's go tree map. Trying to think of a different visual we could choose. And when I say, hey, show this to me as a tree map, you'll notice that it produces a tree map visual for me that shows me a breakdown of all of my failed banks by city-state. And if I wanted to switch this instead of saying by city-state to just by state, I can do that as well and see the breakdown of all of my failed banks by state. So you have the ability to kind of customize things as you go. You can leave the search bar here if you want, or you also have the option here where you can make this and turn this into a standard visual. If I click on this icon right here, that will turn it into a standard visual. The Q&A search will go away, and it just makes it a standard visual at that point. So a really powerful feature. I definitely recommend expanding and learning more about how Q&A works. There's even another feature called synonyms, which allows you to prepare for if your users type in a column name different than what you're expecting them to. There's some settings in here that allow you to fine-tune the interaction with Q&A. And there's a whole bunch of settings that you can find whenever you have Q&A launched as well to be able to show that interaction. By the way, you'll notice my report page tooltip is still working here. So pretty cool stuff that you can set. All right, so here's how we're going to wrap up the last few minutes that we have of our day. Is we're going to take the solution that we've been developing and we're going to publish this to the Power BI service so that we can share it with others. Now this last 8 to 9 minutes of our day, not everyone's going to be able to follow along because the portions of this are going to assume that you have a Power BI account. So if you don't have a Power BI account ready to go for today, no worries, just watch for this last few minutes. We only have a few minutes left anyway, so don't stress out too much about it. But what I'd like to do is I want to take this report that we've been designing and I want to publish it to the Power BI service. This is that fourth step of that Power BI end-to-end view that we talked about before. Remember this guy from the very beginning of our day We're on to that fourth step that's above my head, where we talk about how do I share the results. We've already talked about these first three stages here. Let me point the right direction. Those first three stages we've already talked about. Now we're on to that fourth stage, which is a pretty quick stage. That's why I don't have a ton of time devoted to it. But we're going to take the solution we've designed, share it with others. It looks like I have the word data refresh there twice. I don't know why I duplicated that. But data refresh can be done here. Security can be done here. Sharing can be done here. There's all sorts of things that we can do once we have our solution published to the cloud. That's the cloud part of Power BI, which is the Power BI service. So to get started with this, I'm going to click the Publish button, which you see on the top of my screen right here. And again, feel free just to watch during this portion of the class. But I'm going to click the Publish button in the top part of my home menu. This is the home menu. You'll see the publish option that I'm highlighting above me right now. When you click the publish button, you may be prompted to sign in. And it's prompting you to sign into your Power BI account, which is likely also your Office 365, or I guess they call it Microsoft 365 now. I am already signed in. You can see right here that I'm already signed into my account, so it's not going to prompt me to sign into my Office 365 account like it might prompt you. So just be aware of that if you do get prompted to sign in, that's because you do need to sign in to be able to publish this to your Power BI tenant. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click the Publish button here. And when I do, it's going to first prompt me to save my work that I've done to my local workstation. So you do need to save a local copy of your work before you go to publish it to the cloud. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Save. And I'll go ahead and save this as my Learn with the Nerds file. And I'll just hit Save. This is saving as a PBIX file, by the way. That's the file extension that Power BI uses. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Save. That's saved a local copy of my work to my workstation, and then it's going to prompt me to choose a workspace to publish to. Now, a workspace may be a totally new word to you if you're new to Power BI, but a workspace you can basically think of as a container that you publish or deploy your Power BI stuff to, okay? So as you're going to share your solutions with others, you need to publish to a workspace. Now, for today's purpose, for the purposes of today's class, I know we had limited time. I already created a workspace ahead of time called Learn with the Nerds. You can see it right here. I did a quick search and found it. But you likely will not have that workspace, but you likely do have a workspace called My Workspace. This is if you have a Power BI account. Everyone has a My Workspace. That is specific to you. That is a kind of a testing ground to test out your solutions that you've created. You publish them to your My Workspace. You can go view them from the web browser then and test them out and see what they look like from the web browser. However, you're not going to generally be sharing your solutions from your My Workspace. Your My Workspace, again, is like your own personal repository, your own personal testing ground. But when you want to share your solutions with others, you're going to need to create a separate workspace from your My Workspace. Like I have done here, I've created one called Learn with the Nerds. And I'll show you how to create one very briefly as we move forward. But I'm going to go ahead and select this Learn with the Nerds workspace and then hit Select to publish to this workspace that I created. Okay, and that'll take a few moments here. It'll take just a few seconds actually. But once it's done, we'll be able to actually go look at that solution from the web browser. And now it's already done. And if I click on the option here that says Open Learn with the Nerds in Power BI, if I were to click on that right here, it will launch open my web browser for me and allow me to view my solution now from the cloud. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and select Open Learn with the Nerds PBIX in Power BI. And when I select that, it's going to launch. Let me move my YouTube stream out of the way here. That's going to launch. Oh, I'm not signed into the right account. Let me go ahead and sign into the right account here. I'm signed in to Brian right now. I could really be really mean to him and mess with Brian here a little bit, but let me not do that. Let me go ahead and sign in to Power BI under my account. All right, so I'm going to sign in. And I'm going to sign in as Devin this time. Okay. And let's type in my password. Sorry guys, I thought I was already signed in. And now I gotta do my two-factor authentication. Let me make sure I do that, sorry. It's asking me to log in from my phone now. There we go, we should be good now. Glad I had my phone near me. All right, so now I can see our Power BI solution that we designed right here. You can see Learn with the Nerds. And by the way, if I had clicked on this from the Power BI desktop, if I click on this again, it'll take me straight to that solution. In fact, it opened up in a different web browser. Let me bring it over here. But here is where it normally would take me. If I had clicked on that from the web browser, it would take me immediately to view my report from the web browser. Now we're on to our last few moments here of class. So I do want to highlight a couple key things here. We've published our solution to the Power BI service. Now we can view our solution. We can interact with it. You can see all that same interaction we had before is still here with inside the web browser. We also have the ability to still see our tooltips work. All of that stuff is still here. Everything still works, but now from the web browser. Now, the next step that I would likely do is share with others. Now, there's multiple ways you can share. You can share an individual report. You can share dashboards. You can share workspaces. You can share what's known as a Power BI app. Unfortunately, we're not going to have the time to get into the nitty-gritty of each of those, but where you can share your solution, you'll find the share option right here. And so I can tell it, who do I want to share with? Ideally, you share to a group of users rather than individual users. So this does tap into your Azure Active Directory, and when it taps into your Azure Active Directory, you can choose, do I want to share this with individual users, or do I want to share this with a Active Directory group of users? So you can leverage the sharing capability here to decide who do you want to share this solution with. So if I select Share Report, on the right-hand side of my screen here now, you'll see where I can actually choose who do I want to share with. Okay? Oops, let me zoom out. All right, so that's one mechanism for sharing that you can do. All right, the other thing that I want to highlight is you can also share through what's known as Power BI apps. The Power BI apps are kind of generally the more recommended way of sharing. Power BI apps can be shared at when you select the workspace. So I can select the workspace name here. And you can see on the top right-hand corner, you can create an app. That's another way that you can share. It's kind of a different methodology on how you share. This is the preferred way of sharing. We'd have to get a little bit, we'd need another half hour to get super deep into that. I also told you I'd show you where you can create new workspaces. You can create new workspaces by expanding the workspaces section right here. So you can see workspaces right here. If I expand workspaces like so, towards the bottom of my screen, you can see where you can create a workspace on the bottom down here. If you select Create Workspace, that's basically creating a new container where you can store your Power BI collateral. Okay? So the last thing I want to highlight here, obviously we didn't have a ton of time to talk about the Power BI service. Take a look at some of our other training. We go much more in depth onto every element of what we talked about today. But the last thing I want to highlight here for you is where you can schedule the data to refresh within your data set. So you can see we have two objects here. We have a report and a data set that are separate objects that we just published. If you want to refresh your data, you would select this little icon I'm pointing at right now, which would allow you to set up a scheduled refresh. And if I were to select that, it would take me to a section here where I can set up a scheduled refresh. I can turn it on, and then I can determine how frequently it is that I want to refresh my data. So this is the area, I want to make sure I point you in the right direction at least, where you would go to make sure you can set up scheduled refreshes of your data set. Because otherwise, I have kind of a static view of my data, and my users are looking at old data that I haven't actually updated on a regular basis. So that's what this scheduled refresh area does, is it ensures that your users are always looking at up-to-date data that as they look at their solutions. Okay? All right. What a whirlwind, right? A lot to cover today. Hopefully you got something out of this. Feel free to go back and watch elements of the class again, rewind, go back and watch again. Don't forget that, again, we do have that special sale going on right now where you can get 75% off of our on-demand learning. That is going on through next Tuesday. Through the end of next Tuesday, you can get that 75% off. Enter in the code EVENT75 when you go into our shopping cart, and that will give you that additional discount. I'm sure we will send an email with some follow-up on that as well if you're still interested and haven't written that down in any way. I also want to let you know this is not the only or last Learn with the Nerds that we're going to be doing. Learn with the Nerds is an event that we've been doing for several months now, about half a year I think now at this point, and you can find our other streams that we've done in the past that are still recorded. We've done some on Power Apps, We've done some on Power BI. We've done some on Power Virtual Agents. They can all be found on our YouTube channel. So make sure you take a look and subscribe to our YouTube channel to see any of these upcoming events that we're going to be doing, including we're going to be doing an event, which I'm sure Julia from my team is posting in the chat already, if she hasn't already. That's going to be focused in on Power BI data flows. So Power BI data flows is not something we talked about today, but we're going to have a Learn with the Nerds in June that focuses in on Power BI data flows. So here's your 2 sentences on what Power BI data flows are. Power BI data flows are all of that data cleansing Power Query stuff that we did this morning. That was in our first hour of the day, but done from the web browser. So you can actually, you don't need the Power BI desktop. You can create data flows and data cleansing processes from the web browser using Power BI data flows from the Power BI service. So look forward to that coming up. That's going to be in June. We usually kind of do these every other month. So look in June for that next upcoming Learn with the Nerds. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Hopefully you enjoyed today's class. I, of course, enjoyed as always. We love teaching Power BI. But let us follow up with you in some other way as well. See how we might be able to help you, whether that be through a hackathon or on-demand learning, or maybe it's even a private training. Of course, let us know. We'd love to help you out. And thank you so much for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate it, everybody. Thank you.